Chapter 1. Introduction. Welcome to Sleepy Side Stories, where we explore the strange, the unexplained, and the quietly unsettling. If you're new here, consider subscribing. These stories are meant to accompany you as you drift off, somewhere between waking thought and dream. Tonight we're talking about the Men in Black. Not the movie version. Not the ones with sunglasses and memory-wiping devices and a sense of humour. The other ones. The earlier ones. The figures who appeared in hallways and living rooms and hotel lobbies in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, who knocked on doors after people saw things in the sky they couldn't explain. The ones who spoke in flat, mechanical voices, who seemed not quite human, who left witnesses confused, frightened, and silent. I've been thinking about them for weeks now, trying to remember where I first heard the stories. Was it a book? A website? A conversation I overheard? The details blur together. Sometimes I think I remember more than I actually read. Sometimes I wonder if I'm confusing one case with another, or if I'm remembering something that never happened at all. That's the thing about the Men in Black. The stories themselves resist clarity. They slip and shift. Witnesses describe encounters they can barely recall, conversations they can't quite piece together, visitors who vanished without using the door. The reports are dreamlike even when they're being told, even when the person telling them insists every word is true. So maybe it's appropriate that I tell these stories the same way, quietly, uncertainly, drifting between what I know and what I think I remember. The Men in Black are not a single phenomenon. They're a collection of encounters, a pattern that emerged slowly across decades. Witnesses to unidentified flying objects would see something strange in the sky, sometimes report it, sometimes keep it to themselves. And then, days or weeks later, there would be a knock at the door. The visitors were almost always men, almost always dressed in black suits that seemed too formal, too clean, too precise. They arrived in pairs sometimes, alone other times. They claimed to be from the government, or they implied it without quite saying so. They asked questions about what the witness had seen. They suggested, with varying degrees of directness, that it might be better not to talk about it. Not to tell anyone else. Not to file another report. And then they left. But it was the details around these visits that made them strange. The way the men moved, the way they spoke, the way they looked. Their skin was often described as pale, sometimes with an unnatural smoothness or an odd texture. Their clothing fit strangely, as if they weren't used to wearing it, or as if it had been selected by someone who didn't quite understand how human beings dressed. Their questions were stilted, their speech patterns wrong. They mispronounced common words. They seemed confused by ordinary objects. Some witnesses said the men had no eyebrows or eyelashes. Others mentioned an unusual gait, a mechanical quality to their movements. There were reports of visitors who seemed not to blink, or who blinked too much, as if they'd been told to blink but didn't know the rhythm. And after they left, things got stranger still. Witnesses would try to remember the conversation and find gaps, whole minutes unaccounted for. They'd recall answering the door but not closing it, seeing the men walk toward a car but not watching them drive away. The vehicles themselves were often described as brand new, impossibly clean, models that didn't quite match anything currently in production. I'm not sure when the term Men in Black was first used. The phrase itself feels cinematic, dramatic, like something invented for a headline or a book cover. But the encounters predated the label. They were happening quietly, individually, scattered across the United States and occasionally beyond before anyone had a name for the pattern. Early UFO researchers started comparing notes. They realized they were hearing similar stories from different witnesses who had never met, who lived in different states, who had no reason to coordinate their accounts, men in black suits. Strange questions, implied threats, confusion afterward. The reports shared a texture, a quality that was hard to articulate but impossible to miss once you knew to look for it. These weren't typical government agents. They weren't private investigators or journalists or debunkers. They were something else, something that felt wrong in a way witnesses struggled to describe. Were they real? Were they hallucinations? Were they some kind of shared psychological response to the stress of seeing something impossible? Or were they exactly what they appeared to be? Visitors from somewhere else trying very hard to pass as human and not quite succeeding? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. But I keep coming back to the stories. I keep thinking about the people who opened their doors and found someone standing there who looked almost right but wasn't. Someone who asked questions they shouldn't have known to ask. Someone who left without leaving tracks. There's a particular quality to these encounters that's hard to name. It's not quite fear, though fear is part of it. It's not quite confusion, though witnesses were almost always confused. It's something closer to wrongness, a sense that the normal rules had been suspended, that reality had become thin, permeable, unreliable. People who encountered the men in black often reported feeling strange before the visit even happened. A sense of being watched, odd phone calls with no one on the other end, cars parked outside their homes that disappeared when approached, dreams that felt too vivid, too coherent, too much like memories of things that hadn't happened yet. After the encounter, the feeling would persist. Witnesses would find themselves forgetting what they'd been about to say, losing track of time, misplacing objects. Some reported electronic disturbances, phones that stopped working, radios that produced static, clocks that ran backward. Were these effects caused by the men in black? Were they coincidences, made meaningful only by the witness's heightened state of awareness? Or were they symptoms of something larger, some disruption in the normal flow of things that both produced the UFO sighting and attracted the strange visitors? I think about this sometimes late at night. I try to imagine what it would be like to open the door and find someone standing there who looked wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Someone whose questions suggested they already knew everything I was about to say. Someone who made me feel, just by being present, that I had crossed into territory I was not supposed to enter. Would I be able to describe it afterward? Would I remember the details? Or would the encounter slip away from me even as I tried to hold on to it, leaving me with only impressions, fragments, a sense that something important had happened that I could no longer fully recall? The men in black seem to appear at boundaries, at the edge of what we know and what we don't, at the moment when someone has seen too much, or asked too many questions, or gotten too close to something they weren't meant to find. They are in some sense guardians of the threshold, enforcers of the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever lies beyond it. They show up to remind witnesses that there are things they should not have seen, conversations they should not be having, knowledge they should not possess. But they do this in the strangest possible way, not with clear threats or legal action, or any of the tools available to actual government agents. Instead, they arrive in ill-fitting suits and ask questions that don't quite make sense, and leave witnesses feeling as if they've just woken from a dream they can't quite remember. It's as if the men in black themselves are not quite real, as if they exist in the same uncertain space as the UFOs that preceded them, neither fully present nor fully absent, neither entirely material nor entirely imagined. Maybe that's the point. Maybe they're not meant to be understood or investigated or explained. Maybe they're meant to confuse, to destabilize, to make witnesses doubt their own perceptions and memories, to ensure that even if someone saw something they weren't supposed to see, they won't be able to speak about it clearly enough for anyone else to believe them. Or maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe the men in black are exactly what the witnesses said they were. Strange men in black suits who showed up uninvited and asked uncomfortable questions and then left. No deeper meaning, no cosmic significance, just one more piece of the larger puzzle of unexplained phenomena that we've been trying to solve for decades without getting any closer to an answer. I should tell you that I've never seen the men in black myself. I've never witnessed a UFO. I've never opened my door to find someone standing there who shouldn't exist. But I've read the accounts, I've listened to the interviews, I've traced the pattern of encounters across decades and geography and different groups of witnesses, and the more I learn, the less certain I become about what any of it means. That's what we're going to explore tonight. Not answers, because I don't have any, but stories, cases, encounters reported by people who seemed credible, who had nothing obvious to gain from lying, who were often reluctant to share what had happened to them because they knew how it would sound. We'll move slowly through the history of these reports. We'll look at specific cases, at individual witnesses, at the strange details that accumulated over time into a pattern no one could quite explain. We'll consider theories, some more plausible than others. We'll trace echoes in folklore and mythology, searching for earlier versions of the same archetype. And we'll let the stories drift and blur and contradict each other, because that's what they do. The men in black don't fit neatly into boxes. They resist explanation. They exist in the gaps between certainty and doubt, between memory and dream, between what we saw and what we think we saw. So settle in, get comfortable, let your mind relax. We're going to spend the next while in that uncertain space. The territory between waking and sleep, between fact and story, between the world as we know it and the world as it might be if the rules were slightly different than we thought. The men in black are waiting there. They've been waiting for a long time. And maybe, just maybe, if we're quiet enough and patient enough, we'll start to understand what they want. Or at least why they keep knocking on doors that should have stayed closed. Let's begin. Chapter 2. Origins and Early Lore. The story begins, as far as I can tell, in the early 1950s, though even that feels uncertain. There might have been earlier encounters that were never reported, never written down, never connected to the pattern that would later emerge. But the documented history, the trail we can follow, seems to start around 1952 or 53. The world was different then. The modern UFO phenomenon was still new, still taking shape. Kenneth Arnold's sighting of flying saucers over Mount Rainier had happened only a few years earlier, in 1947. The Roswell incident was fresh in people's minds, still unexplained, still generating speculation. UFO research was largely amateur, conducted by enthusiasts who published newsletters and corresponded by mail and held meetings in living rooms and community centres. It was a small community. People knew each other, or knew of each other. When someone had a significant sighting or developed a new theory, word spread through informal networks. There was excitement, a sense of being on the edge of something important, of uncovering secrets the government didn't want known, and then some of those researchers started to go quiet. Albert K. Bender is usually cited as the first, or if not the first, then the most significant early case, the one that established the pattern. Bender lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He was young, in his early 30s I think, working at a factory. His real passion was UFOs. He'd founded an organization called the International Flying Saucer Bureau in 1952. It was small but energetic, publishing a newsletter called Space Review that went out to subscribers across the United States and internationally. Bender took the work seriously. He collected reports, corresponded with witnesses, tried to develop theories that could explain the sightings. He seems to have been genuinely committed to understanding the phenomenon, not just sensationalizing it. And then, in September of 1953, everything stopped. Space Review published its final issue. The International Flying Saucer Bureau shut down. Bender sent a brief statement to his subscribers explaining that he was ceasing all UFO-related activities. He'd learned the truth about flying saucers, he said, but he'd been advised not to share it. The information was frightening. It was being withheld for humanity's own good. He couldn't say more. That was it. No explanation, no details, just silence. Other researchers tried to find out what had happened. They wrote to Bender, called him, pressed him for information. He refused to elaborate. He seemed genuinely frightened. Some who knew him said he looked different afterward, shaken, older somehow. It would be years before Bender said anything more about it. When he finally did speak, when he published his book Flying Saucers and the Three Men in 1962, the account he gave was strange enough that many people dismissed it entirely. According to Bender, he'd been visited by three men, not government agents, not military personnel, but something else, something not human. They'd appeared in his bedroom, he said, materialized there without using the door. They wore black clothes and had eyes that glowed. They communicated telepathically. They told him things about the UFO phenomenon that he was forbidden to share. They warned him to stop his research immediately, and then they left, vanishing the same way they'd arrived. I've read different versions of this story. Some include details that others leave out. There's mention of a strange smell, sulfuric or chemical, that lingered after the visitors departed. Or I think there is. I can't find that in Bender's own account, but I remember reading it somewhere. Maybe it was someone else's case. Maybe I'm confusing two different encounters. That happens a lot with these stories. The details migrate. Elements from one case show up in descriptions of another. Witnesses remember things they later doubt. Researchers fill gaps with speculation that gets repeated as fact. What's interesting about Bender's case is how much of it feels like a template for what would come later. The men in black, the warning to stop investigating, the sense of fear that persisted afterward, the reluctance to speak about it even years later. But Bender's version was extreme. Too extreme, maybe. The glowing eyes, the telepathy, the materialization in a locked room. It was easier to dismiss than to accept. Easier to assume he'd had some kind of breakdown, or that he was fabricating the story for attention, or that he'd simply gotten scared for more ordinary reasons and constructed a narrative to justify his withdrawal from UFO research. And yet, even as people dismissed Bender's specific claims, other researchers began reporting similar visits. Not quite the same, the details varied. But the pattern was there. Men in dark suits, questions about UFO research or sightings, warnings, either explicit or implied, to stop talking about what they'd seen or learned. These later visitors didn't materialize in bedrooms or communicate telepathically. They knocked on doors, they arrived during the day, they presented themselves as government officials or investigators. They seemed, at least initially, like normal human beings. But there were always strange details, always something wrong. I wonder sometimes if Bender's account poisoned the well, if his story was so outlandish that it made it harder for people to take later reports seriously, or maybe it set expectations. Maybe witnesses who encountered the men in black after reading Bender's book interpreted their own experiences through that lens, looking for elements that matched his narrative and overlooking things that didn't. Memory is unreliable. Perception is shaped by expectation. We see what we're prepared to see, and we remember things in ways that make sense to us, that fit patterns we already recognize. But not always. Sometimes we see things that don't make sense at all, things we have no framework for understanding, and those are the experiences that stick with us, that we can't explain away or fit into comfortable categories. The Men in Black reports from the 1950s have that quality. They feel genuine in their strangeness. The witnesses sound confused, uncertain, almost apologetic. They're not claiming anything grandiose, they're just describing what happened, even when what happened doesn't make any logical sense. A man in a black suit arrived at the door. He asked questions he shouldn't have known to ask. He spoke in an odd way. He left, and afterward the witness felt strange, disoriented, unable to account for how much time had passed. Simple details, but unsettling in their simplicity. There's a researcher named Gray Barker who documented many of these early cases. He knew Bender personally. He was involved in UFO research himself, publishing books and magazines, collecting accounts from witnesses across the country. Barker wrote about the Men in Black extensively. He may have been the one who popularized the term, though I'm not certain about that. He definitely shaped how people understood the phenomenon, compiling reports and identifying common elements and suggesting theories about who or what the Men in Black might be. But Barker was also known for embellishing stories, for blurring the line between fact and speculation, for presenting rumours and unconfirmed accounts as if they were documented truth. So there's always a question with the cases he reported of how much is real and how much is invention. That's frustrating. I want clear answers. I want to know which accounts are reliable and which aren't. But maybe that ambiguity is appropriate. Maybe it fits the nature of the phenomenon itself, which seems to resist clarity and documentation and proof. The Men in Black appear in stories that are always a little blurry, encounters that witnesses half remember, details that shift depending on who's telling the story, evidence that vanishes or turns out to have never existed in the first place. They exist in the gap between what we can verify and what we can only suspect, between documented fact and rumoured possibility. After Bender, the reports continued. Through the 1950s and into the 60s, witnesses who had UFO sightings would sometimes receive visits from men in black suits. The encounters followed similar patterns, but never exactly the same details. Sometimes the visitors claimed to be from the Air Force, sometimes they showed identification, though witnesses who looked at it carefully often found it strange or inconsistent. Sometimes they implied government affiliation without stating it directly, letting the witness assume whatever made sense to them. The questions varied. What did you see? Who have you told? Do you have photographs? Have you filed a report? The warnings varied too. Some visitors were explicit, "Stop talking about this." Others were subtle, simply suggesting that it might be better for the witness not to draw attention to themselves, that certain topics were best left alone, that there were things people weren't meant to know. And then the strange details would emerge, details the witnesses often didn't mention until later, almost as afterthoughts, as if they hadn't seemed significant at the time. The visitor's skin had an odd texture, smooth, almost waxy. Their movements were stiff, mechanical. They seemed uncomfortable sitting in chairs, as if they weren't used to furniture. They asked about ordinary objects as if they'd never seen them before. What is this? How does it work? One witness, I forget who, described a visitor picking up a ballpoint pen and examining it with what seemed like genuine curiosity, clicking it repeatedly, watching the tip appear and retract, as if the mechanism was fascinating and unfamiliar. Another witness mentioned that the visitor's suit, while perfectly clean and well pressed, seemed to have been put on incorrectly. The buttons were done up wrong, or the tie was knotted in a way that didn't quite work. Small things, easy to overlook, but noticeable if you paid attention. I try to imagine these encounters, try to picture opening the door and finding someone standing there who looks almost right but isn't, someone whose questions suggest they know things they shouldn't know, someone who makes you feel, without quite being able to explain why, that something is very wrong. Would I notice the details? Would I register the strangeness in the moment or only later, when I tried to remember what had happened? I think I'd be polite. I think I'd answer their questions, because that's what you do when someone in a suit asks you questions. I think I'd only realise afterward how odd the whole thing was, how the conversation hadn't quite made sense, how they'd left without saying goodbye, without me seeing them go. And then I'd start to doubt myself, start to wonder if I'd misremembered, if the details I thought I recalled were accurate, or if I'd filled them in later, trying to make sense of an experience that didn't fit any category I understood. That's the insidious thing about the men in black. They don't just frighten people, they make people doubt their own memories, their own perceptions, their own ability to distinguish between what happened and what they think happened. By the early 1960s, the men in black had become a recognised part of UFO lore. Not mainstream, not widely known outside UFO research circles, but established within that community. When someone reported a sighting and then mentioned a strange visit afterward, other researchers would nod knowingly. They'd heard similar stories, it fit the pattern. But even then, even within the UFO community, there was disagreement about what it meant. Were the men in black government agents trying to suppress information about UFOs? That was one theory. It made a certain kind of sense. If the government knew something about the phenomenon and wanted to keep it secret, they might send people to intimidate witnesses. The strange behaviour could be explained as psychological tactics designed to confuse and frighten. But why would government agents behave so oddly? Why the weird questions, the ill-fitting clothes, the mechanical movements? If the goal was intimidation, why not be more direct, more professional, more convincingly official? Another theory was that the men in black were themselves not human. Aliens, perhaps, trying to prevent witnesses from sharing information about their presence. Or some kind of shapeshifters, able to assume human form but not quite getting the details right. That would explain the strangeness, the sense that they were performing humanity rather than embodying it, the odd gaps in their knowledge about ordinary objects and customs. But it raised other questions. Why would aliens care about individual witnesses? Why go to the trouble of dressing up and knocking on doors instead of just erasing memories or preventing people from speaking through some more efficient means? I don't know. Neither theory feels complete. Both leave gaps, questions, pieces that don't quite fit. What strikes me about these early reports is how quiet they were. These weren't dramatic confrontations. The men in black didn't break down doors or make explicit threats. They just showed up, asked questions, created a sense of unease, and left. The fear came later. The confusion came later. The sense that something had happened that shouldn't have been possible, and by then, there was no way to prove it. No evidence, no photographs, just the witness's account and the strange feeling that lingered long after the visitors had gone. The men in black operated in that space, the unverifiable, the uncertain, the gap between what happened and what could be proven to have happened. Maybe that was strategic, maybe it was the nature of what they were, or maybe I'm reading too much into it, finding patterns where none exist, seeing significance in details that were just random coincidences. I'm not sure anymore. The more I think about this, the less certain I become. But the stories are there, in old newsletters and letters and recorded interviews, people describing encounters that frightened them in ways they struggled to articulate, visitors who seemed wrong in subtle ways that accumulated into something deeply unsettling. The men in black were out there in those years, knocking on doors, asking questions, leaving witnesses confused and afraid, and somewhere, someone knew why. Or maybe no one knew. Maybe the men in black were just as confused as the people they visited, just as uncertain about what they were doing and why. That possibility unnerves me more than the others. The idea that there's no plan, no purpose, no explanation. Just a phenomenon happening for reasons no one understands, following patterns no one designed. But that might be closer to the truth than any theory we've developed. The universe is full of things we don't understand. Adding one more mystery to the list shouldn't surprise us. Still, we keep looking for answers. We keep telling the stories, comparing accounts, searching for the detail that will make everything clear. We'll keep doing that for a while longer tonight, moving through the cases, following the trail wherever it leads, even if it leads nowhere at all. Chapter 3, The Hopkins Encounter. There's a case from Maine, 1976. September, I think, though the exact date escapes me now. It's one of the most detailed men in black encounters on record, and also one of the strangest. The witness was a doctor, Herbert Hopkins. He lived in Orchard Beach, a small town on the coast. He was a family physician, respectable, credible, not someone given to fantasy or exaggeration. He also practiced hypnotherapy, which is relevant because that's how he became involved with UFO research in the first place. Hopkins had been asked to consult on an abduction case. A local man claimed to have been taken aboard a craft, examined, and returned with missing time and strange memories. Hopkins was using hypnosis to help recover those memories, to access whatever the man's conscious mind had suppressed or forgotten. It was evening work, sessions after Hopkins finished his regular practice. Nothing too intense, nothing that consumed his life. Just a consultation, a favour for researchers who needed someone with his particular skills. He didn't expect it to lead anywhere dangerous. The phone rang one evening. Hopkins was alone in the house. His wife and children had gone out to a movie or dinner, I'm not sure which. He answered. The voice on the other end identified itself as a representative of a UFO organisation. I don't remember the name. The caller said he wanted to discuss the abduction case Hopkins was working on. Would it be possible to come by and talk about it? Tonight, perhaps? Hopkins said yes, why not? It seemed like a reasonable request. Someone from the UFO research community wanting to compare notes, discuss methodology, share information. That happened all the time in those circles. He hung up the phone, walked from the phone to the door maybe 30 feet. When he opened it, a man was already standing there. Hopkins mentioned this detail in his account, the impossibility of it. The caller couldn't have reached his house in the time between hanging up and answering the door. Couldn't have even made it from a car parked outside. The timing didn't work, but there he was, a man in a black suit waiting to be invited in. Hopkins described him carefully. Later, when he told the story, he was precise about the details, as if he'd studied the visitor, catalogued every strange element, knowing he'd need to remember it exactly. The man was completely hairless, no eyebrows, no eyelashes. His head was smooth, though whether naturally bald or shaved, Hopkins couldn't tell. The skin was pale, unnaturally so, with a texture that seemed wrong. Smooth like plastic, Hopkins said, or like skin that had never seen the sun, never weathered, never aged in the normal way. The visitor wore lipstick, bright red, smeared slightly, as if applied by someone who didn't know how lipstick was supposed to look. The colour stood out sharply against the pale skin. His suit was black, perfectly clean, perfectly pressed, a white shirt underneath, a tie. Everything correct in the formal sense, but wrong in some way Hopkins struggled to articulate. Too perfect, maybe. Too much like a costume. Hopkins invited him in. I've tried to imagine that moment. The door open, this strange figure standing there, and Hopkins making the decision to let him into his house. Did he feel the wrongness immediately, or did it only register later, once the visitor was inside and speaking? They sat in the living room, Hopkins in one chair, the visitor in another. The man's movements were odd, stiff, mechanical, as if his joints didn't quite work the way human joints should. He sat carefully, precisely, like someone performing an action they'd observed but never fully understood. The conversation started normally enough. The visitor asked about the abduction case. Hopkins answered, sharing some details about the sessions, the witness's memories, the methods he was using. Standard consultation talk. And then the visitor did something strange. He asked Hopkins if he had a coin. Hopkins checked his pocket, found one, handed it over. A penny, I think, or maybe a quarter. The visitor held it in his palm, asked Hopkins to watch carefully. The coin began to fade, not immediately, gradually, growing transparent, less solid, less real. Hopkins watched it happen, watched the metal lose its substance, become ghostly, become nothing. The visitor's palm was empty. The coin hadn't fallen, hadn't been palmed or pocketed, it had simply ceased to exist. I've read this account multiple times. I've tried to find alternative explanations, stage magic, misdirection, hallucination brought on by stress or suggestion. But Hopkins was adamant. He saw what he saw. The coin vanished while he watched it, and there was no trick involved. Nothing sleight of hand could explain. The visitor spoke while Hopkins was still processing what had happened. His voice was flat, emotionless, mechanical, like speech produced by something that had learned language but didn't understand the human element of it. The rhythms were wrong, the inflections missing. He told Hopkins something disturbing. He said that just as the coin had vanished, so could Hopkins's heart stop, just like that, gradually ceasing to function until there was nothing left. It wasn't phrased as a threat exactly, more like a statement of fact, an observation. But the meaning was clear. Hopkins should stop working on the abduction case, should destroy his notes, should never speak about it again. The visitor stood up, the same careful mechanical movement. He told Hopkins in that flat voice that his energy was running low. He needed to leave. He walked to the door. Hopkins followed, though I'm not sure if he opened it or if the visitor opened it himself. What happened next is where the account becomes even stranger, if that's possible. The visitor didn't walk to a car. He walked to the end of the driveway and turned. There was a light there, Hopkins said, a bright blue-green light hovering just above the ground. The visitor walked into it, or toward it, and then both the light and the visitor were gone. No sound, no vehicle, just presence and then absence. Hopkins stood in his doorway looking at the empty street, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to make it make sense. When his family came home, he told them everything, immediately while the details were still fresh. His wife and son confirmed later that he was shaken, genuinely frightened in a way they'd never seen before. This wasn't a man who had experienced something ambiguous and was trying to convince himself it was significant. This was a man who had encountered something impossible and knew it. Hopkins destroyed his notes on the abduction case, stopped the hypnotherapy sessions, withdrew from UFO research entirely. He followed the visitor's instructions to the letter, but he also talked about it, gave interviews, described the encounter in detail. Maybe he felt that the warning only applied to the specific case he'd been working on, not to the phenomenon in general. Or maybe, after some time passed and his heart kept beating normally, he decided the risk was worth it. I wonder about that sometimes, about the cost of speaking versus the cost of silence, about whether sharing these experiences protects us or endangers us further. The Hopkins case has been analysed extensively. Researchers have picked it apart looking for inconsistencies, for evidence of fabrication or misremembering. They haven't found much. Hopkins was a credible witness, a professional man with no history of mental illness, no obvious motive for inventing such a story. His account remained consistent across multiple tellings, across years. Some details are disputed. The exact colour of the light at the end of the driveway. Whether the visitor's lips were painted red, or naturally red, or just appeared red in the lighting. Small things. But the core of the story doesn't change. A strange man came to Hopkins' house. He had no hair, wore ill-applied makeup, moved mechanically. He made a coin disappear. He warned Hopkins to stop his UFO research. He left in a way that defied normal explanation. Those facts are established, as much as anything in this field can be established. What they mean is another question entirely. I keep coming back to the coin. The vanishing coin. It's such a specific detail. So dramatic and yet so intimate. A small magic trick, the kind you might see a street performer do for spare change. Except there was no trick, no explanation. Just an object ceasing to exist while someone watched. Why do that? If the goal was intimidation, there are more direct methods. If the goal was to demonstrate power, there are more impressive displays. Making a coin vanish seems almost whimsical, almost playful, except for the threat that accompanied it. Your heart could stop the same way, just fade, just cease. That's not playful, that's terrifying in its quietness. No violence, no confrontation, just the suggestion that your continued existence is as fragile as a penny held in an unfamiliar hand. Hopkins mentioned other strange things that happened around the time of the visit. Phone calls where no one spoke, a sense of being watched, electronic equipment malfunctioning in ways it hadn't before. Standard elements of the Men in Black phenomenon, but unsettling nonetheless. His wife and son had their own encounter not long after. They were visited by a woman and two men, all dressed formally, all behaving strangely. The woman wore clothes that seemed decades out of date. Her makeup was excessive, theatrical, wrong. She asked strange questions, seemed confused by ordinary objects in the house. They left the same way Hopkins' visitor had left, walking away and vanishing. No car, no visible means of departure. The family moved out of that house eventually. I don't know if the visits were the reason, or if there were other factors, but they left, put distance between themselves and whatever had come knocking. Sometimes I try to imagine what I would do in Hopkins' position. If someone came to my door exhibiting all those signs of wrongness, if they made something vanish in front of me and suggested calmly that I could vanish just as easily, would I comply? Would I destroy my work, stop asking questions, retreat into silence? Or would I do what Hopkins eventually did, which was tell the story despite the warning? Accept the risk in exchange for the possibility that someone might understand, might believe, might add this piece to the larger puzzle? I'd like to think I'd be brave, that I'd prioritize truth over safety. But I don't know. Fear is a powerful motivator, and the fear Hopkins described wasn't the sharp, immediate fear of physical danger. It was something deeper. A fear that the rules he'd relied on his whole life, the basic assumptions about what was real and what was possible, had just been revealed as insufficient. That kind of fear doesn't fade quickly. The Hopkins case is often cited as one of the most credible Men in Black encounters, but credibility doesn't mean explanation. We can believe Hopkins saw what he said he saw, experienced what he said he experienced, and still have no idea what actually happened. Was the visitor human? Was it wearing a disguise? Was the hairlessness a result of alopecia or chemotherapy? The strange skin a medical condition? The mechanical movements a neurological disorder? That would explain some of it, but not the coin, not the instant arrival, not the vanishing departure. Was it something not human, trying to pass as human and failing? That fits the details better. The sense of performance, of someone going through the motions of human behavior without truly understanding it. The makeup applied by someone who'd seen humans wear lipstick but didn't know the subtlety of application. The movements of someone operating a body that didn't quite work the way they expected it to. But that raises the question of why. Why go to such elaborate effort? Why not simply communicate telepathically, or appear in a less embodied form, or use technology to prevent Hopkins from speaking rather than relying on a personal visit and a verbal warning? I don't have answers. I have the account. I have Hopkins' careful descriptions. I have the fact that he was frightened enough to comply, at least initially, with the warning he received. Beyond that, it's speculation. Theories stacked on theories, each one trying to make sense of something that resists sense. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the Men in Black aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to create confusion, uncertainty, doubt. To make witnesses question not just what they saw, but their ability to perceive reality accurately. If that's the goal, it worked. Hopkins spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of that evening, trying to reconcile what happened with what should be possible, never quite succeeding, and we're still doing the same thing, decades later, analysing the case, debating the details, searching for the interpretation that will make it all clear. The coin is gone. The visitor is gone. Hopkins himself is gone now, I believe, passed away years ago. But the story remains, strange and specific and impossible to dismiss. A man in black came to a house in Maine. He made a coin vanish. He warned a doctor to stay silent. He left without using the door. And somewhere, somehow, he might still be out there, walking up to doors, making things disappear, reminding people that there are boundaries they should not cross. I should move on. There are other cases to consider, other encounters. But I keep thinking about Hopkins standing in his doorway, watching a light fade into nothing, knowing that everything he'd believed about the world had just shifted. That moment of recognition, of understanding that reality was larger and stranger than he'd imagined. I think about that a lot, more than I probably should. Chapter 4. Keel's reports and hotel visitors. John Keel wrote about the men in black more than almost anyone else. He didn't discover them, didn't have the first encounter, but he documented them extensively. Collected accounts from across the country, interviewed witnesses, tried to understand the pattern. Keel was a journalist, a researcher, someone who approached the paranormal with skepticism, but also genuine curiosity. He spent years investigating UFO sightings, cryptid reports, strange phenomena of all kinds. He wrote books that are still read today, still cited, still debated. The Mothman Prophecies is probably his most famous work, but he wrote others. Operation Trojan Horse, The Eighth Tower, books full of cases and theories and uncomfortable questions. The men in black appear throughout his work, not as a side note but as a central element of the larger phenomenon. Keel believed they were important, significant in ways that went beyond simple witness intimidation. He also believed they were getting stranger. Keel documented dozens of men in black encounters during the 1960s and early 70s. He talked to witnesses directly, heard their stories firsthand, noticed patterns that others might have missed. One pattern that emerged was the hotel connection. Witnesses would receive phone calls at hotels, not at their homes, not at their workplaces, but at hotels where they were staying temporarily. The callers would know details they shouldn't know: what room the witness was in, why they were travelling, what they'd seen or investigated recently. The calls were strange in themselves. The voices were often mechanical, stilted, similar to the speech patterns reported in face-to-face encounters. Sometimes there would be odd sounds in the background, clicking, humming, static that didn't sound like normal phone interference. The callers would ask questions or issue warnings. Sometimes they'd request meetings, a face-to-face conversation in the hotel lobby, or in the witness's room, or at a nearby location. And sometimes, when the witness agreed to meet, the visitors would arrive impossibly quickly. Seconds after the call ended, already in the building, already waiting, as if they'd known the answer before the question was asked. There's an account Keel documented. I'm trying to remember the witness's name, but it escapes me now. A researcher who was investigating sightings in West Virginia. This was during the Mothman period, 1966 or 67, when that area was experiencing a wave of unusual activity. The researcher was staying at a small hotel, nothing fancy, just a place to sleep between interviews and site visits. He'd been there 2 nights when the phone rang, late evening, after dark. The voice on the other end knew his name, knew what he was working on, asked if they could discuss his findings. The researcher said yes, suggested they meet in the morning. No, the voice said. Now would be better. In the lobby. 5 minutes. The researcher agreed, hung up the phone, started toward the door of his room and then paused, realizing the strangeness of it. The caller had known exactly where he was staying, what room he was in, even though he hadn't told anyone outside his immediate contacts. The request for an immediate meeting was odd. The whole thing felt wrong. But he went down anyway. Curiosity, maybe, or a sense that refusing would be worse than complying. The lobby was empty except for one man, black suit, white shirt, standing near the entrance, not sitting, not moving, just standing there as if he'd been waiting a long time. The researcher approached him, asked if he was the one who'd called. The man nodded. They sat in the lobby chairs, though the visitor's sitting motion was awkward, mechanical, like Hopkins had described, as if the body wasn't entirely under the visitor's control. The conversation that followed was circular, repetitive. The visitor asked the same questions multiple times, phrased slightly differently each time. "What have you seen? Who have you told? What do you think it means?" the researcher answered. Tried to be helpful, tried to understand what the visitor wanted, but the questions kept looping back, covering the same ground, going nowhere. And then the researcher noticed something. The visitor wasn't blinking. His eyes stayed open, fixed, unmoving except when his head turned. It was subtle at first, easy to miss in a brief conversation. But as the minutes stretched on, the absence of blinking became noticeable. Unsettling. The researcher mentioned this detail later. Said it was what finally convinced him something was deeply wrong. Not the strange questions or the circular conversation or even the mechanical movements, but the eyes, the unblinking stare. Eventually the visitor stood up, said he had what he needed, walked toward the hotel entrance and out into the night. The researcher watched him go, expecting to see him get into a car, but the parking lot was empty. The man simply walked into the darkness and disappeared. When the researcher went back to his room, he realized something strange. He couldn't remember how long the conversation had lasted. It felt like 15 minutes, maybe 20. But when he checked his watch, more than 2 hours had passed. Lost time, a gap he couldn't account for. The conversation should have taken 20 minutes at most, even with the repetitive questions. Where had the rest of the time gone? He had no memory of it, nothing missing exactly, but nothing there either, just a blank space where time should have been. I stayed in a hotel once that felt wrong in a similar way. Not the same situation, nothing paranormal, but there was something about the space that made me uncomfortable. The hallways were too quiet. The lighting was dim, yellowish, casting strange shadows. My room was at the end of a long corridor, and every time I walked back to it I felt watched. Nothing happened. No phone calls, no visitors, just a vague sense of unease that persisted through my stay. But I thought about that researcher's account while I was there. Wondered what I would do if my phone rang and a strange voice asked to meet me in the lobby. Would I go? Would I refuse? Would I convince myself it was nothing? Just a normal phone call, nothing to worry about. I like to think I'd be cautious, but I also know how curiosity works, how it overrides caution, makes you do things you know aren't wise. Keel documented other hotel encounters, similar patterns, phone calls from people who shouldn't know where the witness was staying, requests for immediate meetings, visitors who arrived impossibly quickly and left without trace. Sometimes the visitors would come directly to the witness's room. A knock on the door, late at night. Men in black suits standing in the hallway, asking to come in, to talk, to ask their circular, repetitive questions. Witnesses described feeling paralyzed in those moments, not physically unable to move, but psychologically frozen. Unable to refuse entry, unable to end the conversation, unable to do anything but answer the questions and wait for the visitors to leave. Afterward, they'd struggle to remember details. The conversation would feel dreamlike, fragmented. They'd remember the visitor's presence, the sense of wrongness, but not specific words or questions. Time would be missing, unaccounted for. It's as if the encounters existed in a different kind of space. Not quite real, not quite dream, somewhere in between. Keel believed the men in black were not government agents. That much he stated clearly. The behavior was too strange, too inconsistent with any known intelligence operation. The questions were wrong. The methods were wrong. If the goal was intimidation or information gathering, there were far more effective approaches. He thought they might be something else, something non-human trying to interact with humans in ways that made sense to them but not to us, or something that existed in a different dimension, a different level of reality, manifesting in our world but not fully understanding how it worked. That would explain the wrongness, the sense that they were following rules we couldn't perceive, operating according to logic we couldn't comprehend. But even Keel admitted he was speculating. He didn't know. He just kept collecting accounts, documenting encounters, searching for patterns that might eventually reveal an answer. There's something particularly unsettling about the hotel encounters. Maybe because hotels are already liminal spaces, not home, not truly public, but somewhere in between. Temporary, transitional, places where people exist briefly and then move on. The men in black seem to favour those kinds of spaces. Thresholds, boundaries, places that are neither here nor there. They appear in doorways, in hotel lobbies, on empty streets between streetlights, always at the edge of things, never fully in one place or another. Maybe that's where they're most comfortable, or maybe those are the only places they can manifest, the thin spots where their reality and ours overlap enough for them to cross through. I don't know. I'm guessing. But it feels right somehow. The idea that they exist at boundaries, at transition points, at the places where one thing becomes another. Keel also documented the phone calls themselves, not just the ones that preceded physical encounters, but the calls that came on their own. Strange, unsettling conversations that went nowhere, and left witnesses confused. The callers would know things they shouldn't know, personal details, information about recent activities, names of friends and family. They'd reference conversations that had supposedly happened, but that the witness couldn't remember having. Sometimes the calls would come at odd hours, 3 in the morning, 4, times when most people are deeply asleep, but some are just starting to drift, in that space between unconsciousness and waking. The voices were always wrong. Too flat, too mechanical, or sometimes distorted in ways that didn't sound like normal phone static. Words would be drawn out or compressed. The rhythm of speech would be off, and the content of the calls rarely made sense. The caller would ask circular questions, make cryptic statements, issue warnings that were too vague to act on. Or they'd simply breathe, staying on the line without speaking, maintaining the connection until the witness hung up in frustration or fear. One witness Keel interviewed described receiving calls every night for a week. Same time, around 2 in the morning, same voice, flat and mechanical. Each call would last exactly 3 minutes, then end abruptly with a click that didn't sound like a normal disconnect. The caller never identified themselves, just asked questions. What did you see? Are you afraid? Do you understand what's happening? The witness tried not answering, let the phone ring, but the calls continued. Same time, same duration, whether he picked up or not. He tried unplugging the phone. The next night it rang anyway, impossibly, the sound coming from a deadline. After a week the call stopped, just ceased. No explanation, no final message, just silence where there had been nightly intrusions. The witness moved shortly after, couldn't stay in that house, couldn't sleep in that bedroom where the phone had rung from a disconnected line. Too many boundaries had been crossed, too many rules had been broken. I wonder about those phone calls, about what they were meant to accomplish, if they were meant to accomplish anything at all. Maybe they were just contact, someone or something reaching out, trying to communicate, not fully understanding how human conversation worked. The questions were strange because the asker didn't know what questions made sense. The timing was wrong because the concept of appropriate hours didn't translate. Or maybe they were tests, seeing how witnesses would react, how much fear they could tolerate, whether they'd continue investigating or retreat into silence. Or maybe there was no purpose at all. Maybe the calls were side effects of something larger, glitches in whatever process allowed the men in black to interact with our reality. Communication attempts that didn't quite work, that produced sound and connection but not meaning. Keel's work is full of these kinds of encounters. Hotels and phone calls and lost time and visitors who appeared and vanished according to rules no one understood. He documented them meticulously, tried to find patterns, tried to make sense of the senseless. But even he admitted in his later work that he might have been looking at it wrong, that maybe there was no sense to find. Maybe the men in black were inherently nonsensical, operating outside the bounds of human logic, doing things for reasons we could never comprehend. That's a frustrating conclusion. We want answers, we want to understand. But maybe some phenomena resist understanding by their very nature. The men in black show up, ask their strange questions, create their confusion, and leave. They've been doing it for decades, and we're no closer to understanding why than we were in the 1950s when the pattern first emerged. Still, the accounts continue. Even now, occasionally someone reports an encounter that fits the pattern. A strange visitor, odd questions, missing time, the sense that something wrong has crossed their threshold. Keel is gone now. Passed away in 2009, I think, but his documentation remains. Hundreds of cases, detailed interviews, careful analysis of patterns and anomalies. The men in black are in there, woven through his work like a dark thread. Present in almost every investigation he conducted, every wave of sightings he studied, every cluster of high strangeness he documented. They were there in West Virginia during the Mothman incidents. There in New York during the UFO flaps. There in small towns and big cities, in hotels and homes, on phones and in doorways, always watching, always asking, always leaving witnesses more confused than they were before. Sometimes I imagine Keel in one of those hotel rooms, sitting up late going through his notes trying to make connections. The phone rings. He answers. A flat voice on the other end, asking questions that don't quite make sense. Does he recognize it immediately? Does he know, in that moment, that he's crossed from researcher into subject, that the boundary he's been studying has just collapsed around him? I don't know if that ever happened. Keel didn't write about receiving those kinds of calls himself, though he documented plenty of other strange experiences. But it seems inevitable, doesn't it? That someone who spent so much time investigating the men in black would eventually attract their attention. Maybe they called him. Maybe they visited him. Maybe he chose not to write about it, keeping some experiences private, some encounters too personal to share. Or maybe they left him alone. Maybe researchers, unlike witnesses, are exempt from visits. Maybe the men in black only care about people who've seen things directly, not those who collect the stories afterward. I don't know which possibility is more unsettling. The hotel encounters continue in my mind even after I've finished reading about them. I imagine witnesses lying in unfamiliar beds, in unfamiliar rooms, knowing that someone might call, that someone might knock, that the door might open even if it's locked, and a figure in black might step through. The vulnerability of it, the isolation, far from home, in a temporary space, surrounded by strangers, no one to call for help, no way to explain what's happening in a way that would make sense to anyone else, just you and the visitor and the questions that circle without resolving and the time that disappears while you're trying to answer. I think that's why the hotel encounters stay with me. They feel more invasive somehow, more deliberate. The men in black aren't just showing up randomly. They're finding people in transit, in vulnerable moments, in spaces where normal rules already feel suspended. And they're making those spaces stranger still. We should move on. There are other aspects of the phenomenon to explore. Other cases, other theories, other ways of understanding what the men in black might be. But the hotels will stay in the back of my mind. The empty lobbies, the ringing phones, the visitors who arrive impossibly fast and leave without a trace. The spaces where boundaries dissolve and the wrong kind of questions get asked and time slips away while no one's paying attention. Those spaces are still out there, still waiting, still hosting encounters we'll never fully understand. And somewhere, in one of those rooms, a phone might be ringing right now, a flat voice waiting on the other end, questions forming that don't quite make sense, and someone will answer, someone always does. Chapter 5. Vanishing Cars and Disappearing Agents. The cars were always wrong. That's something witnesses mentioned repeatedly, once they started paying attention to the details. The men in black would arrive in vehicles that looked brand new, impossibly clean, sometimes models that didn't quite match anything currently in production. They'd park at odd angles or too far away, or directly in front of the house despite there being no sound of an engine approaching. And when they left, the cars would vanish in ways that defied explanation. Robert Richardson's case is one of the clearest examples. This was in Ohio, 1967. July, I think, though the exact date blurs when I try to recall it. Richardson was driving home late at night, a rural road with minimal traffic. He saw something in the road ahead, an object dark and large blocking his lane. He hit it. Not hard, not at high speed, but there was definite contact. The impact jarred him. He stopped the car, got out to see what he'd struck. Nothing was there. The road was empty. No debris, no object. No sign that anything had been in his path moments before. He checked his car. There was minor damage to the front bumper, consistent with hitting something solid. But whatever he'd hit had disappeared. Richardson went home, tried to make sense of it. Couldn't. The next day he went back to the spot, searched the area, found a small piece of metal lying near the roadside. It was unusual, lightweight, strange composition, not like anything he recognized. He kept it, showed it to a few people. Eventually word got around that he had this odd fragment, this piece of something that shouldn't exist. And then the visitors came. 2 men arrived at Richardson's home. Black suits, white shirts, the standard uniform. They said they were from a government agency, though they didn't specify which one. They wanted the metal fragment. Said it was important, said it needed to be analysed, said Richardson should hand it over for official purposes. Richardson asked to see identification. They showed him something, cards or badges, but he said later that they looked wrong. The printing was off, the photos didn't quite match the men holding them, the agency names were unfamiliar or misspelled. He wasn't sure. The details were fuzzy when he tried to remember them. But he gave them the metal fragment anyway. Something about the encounter made him want to comply, made refusal feel impossible. The men left. Richardson watched them walk to their car. He described it carefully afterward. A black Cadillac, he thought, or something similar. Large, expensive-looking, pristine. Not a speck of dirt on it despite the rural roads, despite the season, despite the impossibility of keeping any vehicle that clean under normal conditions. They got in the car. Richardson was still watching. They drove away, headed down the road toward town, and then, according to Richardson, the car simply wasn't there anymore. He tried to explain this detail to investigators later, struggled to make it sound reasonable. The car had been driving away, moving at normal speed, following the road. He'd looked away for a moment, just a moment, and when he looked back, the car was gone. Not around a curve, not over a hill, just gone. Vanished from a straight stretch of road where it should have still been visible. Richardson went inside, stood by his window for a while waiting to see if the car would reappear, if there was some explanation he'd missed. But the road stayed empty. The men didn't come back. The metal fragment was gone, and Richardson was left with an encounter that made no sense, with missing evidence and a story no one would believe. I've tried to picture that moment. The car driving away, solid and real, and then simply not being there anymore. Not fading, not accelerating out of sight, just absent where it had been present moments before. Would I trust my own perception? Would I convince myself I'd looked away longer than I thought? That the car had simply driven faster than I remembered? That there was a rational explanation I was missing? Or would I accept what I'd seen, even though it violated everything I understood about how the world worked? Richardson seemed certain. The car had vanished. There was no other way to describe it. And that certainty came through in his accounts, in his interviews, in the way he told the story again and again without changing the core details. The car was there and then it wasn't. Simple as that. Impossible as that. Other witnesses reported similar experiences. Men in black arriving in vehicles that seemed wrong, leaving in ways that defied normal physics. There's a case from somewhere in the Midwest, I can't remember the exact location now. A witness had seen lights in the sky, reported them, received a visit days later from two men in dark suits. They asked their questions, issued their vague warnings, headed back to their car. The witness watched from a window. The men got into a black sedan, closed the doors, but the car didn't start. No sound of an engine turning over, no exhaust from the tailpipe. The car simply began moving, silently, smoothly, as if it were gliding rather than driving. It reached the end of the street and turned the corner. The witness ran to another window to keep it in sight. But the next street was empty. No car, no tyre tracks in the fresh snow, no sign that a vehicle had just passed through. The witness checked immediately, went outside, looked at the snow. There were footprints from the visitor's walk to the car, impressions where the car had been parked. But beyond that, nothing. The snow was undisturbed. The car had vanished between one street and the next, leaving no trace of its passage. These accounts accumulate into a pattern, but it's a pattern that resists easy interpretation. Vehicles that look wrong, behave wrong, disappear wrong. They're too clean, too quiet, too prone to vanishing when no one's looking directly at them. Are they real cars? Are they illusions? Are they something in between? Objects that exist in our reality but don't quite follow our rules? I think about stage magic sometimes. The way a good magician misdirects makes you look one way while the trick happens somewhere else. Maybe the men in black use similar techniques. Make witnesses focus on the encounter, the questions, the strangeness of the visitors themselves, while the real impossibility is happening with the vehicles. But that doesn't explain Richardson's case. He was watching, paying attention. The car didn't disappear because he was distracted. It disappeared while he was looking at it, or as close to looking at it as makes no difference. There are accounts of the cars themselves being impossible. Not just their behaviour, but their nature. Witnesses would describe vehicles that seemed to be from the wrong era. A 1973 car that looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line. Not a scratch on it, not a hint of wear, the interior pristine and the exterior gleaming. But also small details that were wrong. The model didn't exist in that colour. The trim package didn't match any standard configuration. The dashboard had features that weren't available that year. Or the car would be too old, decades out of date but in perfect condition. A 1948 sedan in 1968, looking brand new, running silently, no visible exhaust despite the cold weather. The vehicles existed in the wrong time. Like the men in black themselves, they were performing normalcy without quite achieving it, getting most of the details right but missing just enough to create that sense of wrongness, that feeling that something fundamental was off. I remember reading an account, though I can't place where or when now, of a witness who approached one of these cars. The men in black had just left, driven away, but their car was still visible down the street. Parked, maybe, or stopped at an intersection. The witness walked toward it, curious, wanting a closer look. The car started moving before anyone got in. Just began rolling forward, smooth and silent, accelerating away. The witness ran after it for a few steps, then stopped, watched it reach the end of the block and turn. By the time the witness reached that corner, the car was nowhere to be seen, and the street it had turned onto was a dead end, a cul-de-sac with houses on 3 sides and no through traffic. The car should have been there, should have been trapped, should have had to turn around and come back. But it was gone, vanished into a space that had no exit. The witness walked the entire cul-de-sac, checked driveways, looked for garage doors that might have opened and closed, found nothing. The car had driven into an enclosed space and ceased to exist. These stories have a dreamlike quality. The logic of dreams, where things happen without cause, where objects appear and disappear according to rules that make sense in the moment, but dissolve upon examination. Maybe that's what we're dealing with. Not physical cars, but something that presents as physical, something that interacts with our reality enough to be seen, to leave tyre tracks, to carry passengers. But that isn't bound by our limitations, our physics, our requirement that objects remain consistent and traceable. A car that exists when it needs to exist and stops existing when it doesn't. That would explain the vanishings, the impossibilities, the sense witnesses have that they saw something real that nonetheless couldn't have been real. There's another aspect to the vehicle reports that troubles me. The silence. Multiple witnesses mentioned that the men in black's cars made no sound, or almost no sound. A whisper of movement, maybe, a soft hum, but nothing like a normal engine. No rumble, no mechanical noise, no sound of tyres on pavement. This was in the 60s and 70s, remember? Before electric cars, before hybrid engines. Every vehicle on the road made noise. Loud noise if it was old. Quieter noise if it was well maintained, but always noise. The absence of it would have been immediately noticeable. Yet the men in black's vehicles glided silently. Moved without the sounds we associate with movement. Left witnesses wondering if they'd really heard an engine at all, or if they'd just assumed one must be there because cars have engines and engines make noise. But maybe these cars didn't have engines. Maybe they operated on principles we don't understand, using technologies or methods so far beyond our current knowledge that they might as well be magic. Or maybe they weren't cars at all. Maybe they were projections, illusions, constructs designed to look like cars because that's what witnesses expected to see. The men in black needed vehicles to complete their performance of humanity, so vehicles appeared, but the details were wrong because the creators didn't fully understand what they were imitating. I've wondered sometimes if I'd recognize one of these vehicles if I saw it. If there's something about them that's visible to the careful observer, some tell that would mark them as wrong before they vanished. The excessive cleanliness, maybe. The slight mismatch in details. The way they move without proper sound. The sense that they're too perfect. Too much like the idea of a car rather than an actual car with all its minor flaws and accumulated wear. But probably not. Probably I'd just see a car, register it as normal, and only realise later if something strange happened that there had been signs I'd missed. We see what we expect to see. Our brains fill in details, smooth over inconsistencies, make the world make sense even when it doesn't. The men in black and their impossible vehicles exploit that tendency. They present something close enough to normal that we accept it, and by the time we notice the wrongness it's too late. They're already gone. Richardson never got his metal fragment back, never received an explanation for what he'd hit that night on a dark road. The visitors took the evidence and vanished, and with them went any chance of proving that something unusual had occurred. That's another pattern. The men in black don't just intimidate witnesses, they remove evidence, confiscate photographs, take physical samples, make documents disappear. They erase the traces of encounters, leaving only testimony, only the witness's word against the silence of missing proof. And when the witness tries to describe what happened, tries to explain about the visitors and their strange questions and their impossible departures, there's nothing to show. No metal fragment, no photographs, no physical evidence that anything occurred. Just a story about men in black suits and a car that vanished and time that went missing and rules that didn't apply the way they should have. Who believes stories like that without proof? Sometimes I think that's the real purpose of the vehicles. Not transportation exactly, but theatre. A prop in a performance designed to seem almost normal, to hover just on the edge of acceptability, to make witnesses doubt themselves. You saw men arrive in a car, that's normal. You saw them leave in a car, that's normal. The car vanished. Well, maybe you looked away longer than you thought. Maybe it went faster than you realised. Maybe there's a turn you forgot about, a driveway you didn't notice, some mundane explanation for what felt impossible. The vehicle gives witnesses something to doubt, something to second guess. A detail strange enough to be unsettling, but not so outrageous that it can't be rationalized away with enough effort. And while they're focused on the vanishing car, on trying to make that detail make sense, they're not thinking as clearly about the visitors themselves, about the strangeness of their appearance, their behavior, their knowledge, about what it means that someone came to their door with information they shouldn't have had, and warnings that implied consequences they couldn't explain. The vehicles are still being reported occasionally, even now in an era of traffic cameras and cell phones and GPS tracking. People describe encounters with men in black who arrive in cars that seem wrong and leave in ways that defy documentation. The cars evade the cameras somehow, or they're on film but appear normal, nothing unusual visible in the footage. The strangeness only manifests in person, in real time, in the moment of encounter. Technology doesn't capture them properly, can't pin them down, can't provide the proof that would settle the question once and for all, so we're left where we've always been, with witnesses describing what they saw, with accounts that sound impossible but come from credible people who insist every word is true, with a pattern of wrongness that accumulates across decades but never resolves into clear answers. The men in black drive cars that shouldn't exist. They park where they shouldn't fit. They leave without using roads. And somewhere on some street I might walk down tomorrow, one of those cars might be waiting. Pristine and silent and wrong, in ways I won't notice until it's already too late. Richardson's story stayed with him. He told it multiple times over the years, always with the same core details. The impact with something that vanished, the strange metal fragment, the visitors in their too-clean car, the impossible departure. He didn't seek attention for it, didn't seem to want fame or validation. He just wanted people to know what had happened, wanted it documented, wanted someone to understand that the world contained more strangeness than we generally acknowledged. I respect that. The desire to witness accurately, to record truly, even when the recording makes you sound unreliable. The fragment is gone, the car is gone, the men are gone, but the account remains. One more piece in the larger pattern, one more impossible detail in the ongoing mystery of the men in black, and the roads are still there, empty in the late hours, stretching through darkness, waiting for the next person to see something they shouldn't, to collect evidence they won't keep, to watch a car that defies explanation vanish into the space where impossible things happen and leave no trace. We'll move on soon. There are other aspects to explore, other theories to consider, other ways of trying to understand what we're dealing with, but the cars will stay with me, the silent vehicles, the vanishing departures, the sense that the men in black travel between places using methods we can't comprehend, in vehicles that exist just long enough to serve their purpose, and then dissolve back into whatever strange dimension spawned them. They're still out there, still arriving and departing according to rules we don't know, still leaving witnesses standing in driveways, staring at empty roads, wondering where the car went, wondering if it was ever really there at all. Chapter 6. Theories and Interpretations. So what are they? That's the question we keep circling back to. After all the accounts, all the strange details, all the impossible departures and mechanical movements and questions that go nowhere, after Richardson's vanishing car and Hopkins's disappearing coin, and Bender's glowing-eyed visitors, after the hotel encounters and the phone calls and the witnesses left confused and frightened. What are the men in black? I've read theories, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Some well-reasoned, carefully argued, supported by evidence and logic. Others wild speculation, leaps of imagination that feel more like creative writing than serious analysis, and most somewhere in between. Attempts to make sense of the senseless, to impose order on chaos, to find the explanation that will make all the pieces fit. But I'm not sure any of them work completely. Every theory explains some elements while leaving others unaccounted for. Every interpretation captures part of the phenomenon, but misses something essential. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the men in black resist simple explanation because they're not a simple phenomenon. Or maybe I've just read too much, absorbed too many contradictory ideas, and can no longer distinguish between what I know and what I've imagined. The most common explanation, the one that feels most grounded, is that the men in black are government agents. Intelligence operatives, military personnel, someone official conducting witness intimidation as part of a larger program to suppress UFO information. It makes sense on the surface. The government has clear reasons to control what people know about aerial phenomena. National security, public panic prevention, the protection of classified programs. If something genuinely unusual is happening in our skies, if there are craft of unknown origin being observed and documented, then managing that information becomes critical. Sending agents to visit witnesses to discourage them from speaking publicly, to confiscate evidence, to create enough fear and confusion that people self-censor. That's basic intelligence work. It's happened before with other classified subjects. Why not with UFOs? The black suits make sense as a uniform. Professional, intimidating, anonymous. The official credentials, even if examined closely, they seem slightly wrong, could be intentional misdirection. Make the witnesses doubt what they saw, question their own perceptions, wonder if the visitors were really government agents or something else entirely. And the strange behaviour, the mechanical movements, the odd questions, those could be psychological tactics, designed to unsettle, to create cognitive dissonance, to make the encounter memorable in its wrongness so the witness carries that unease long after the visitors leave. But the theory falls apart when you look at the details too closely. Government agents would be better at their jobs. They'd know how to intimidate effectively without drawing attention to themselves. They'd ask relevant questions, not circular nonsense. They wouldn't wear ill-fitting suits or bright red lipstick or behave in ways that made witnesses more likely to talk about the encounter, not less. And the impossible elements, the vanishing cars, the disappearing coins, the materialization in locked rooms, the telepathic communication, those can't be explained by government tactics no matter how sophisticated, unless the government has access to technology far beyond what we publicly acknowledge. Technology that allows for teleportation, materialization, matter manipulation. But if they have those capabilities, why use them for something as mundane as witness intimidation? Why not apply them to more pressing problems? The government theory works until it doesn't. Until you hit the wall of impossibility that runs through these accounts. Until you have to either dismiss the witnesses as mistaken, or accept that something beyond conventional explanation is occurring. Another theory suggests the men in black are extraterrestrial. Aliens attempting to pass as human beings, sent to control information about their presence on Earth, but not quite understanding humanity well enough to blend in successfully. This explains the wrongness. The mechanical movements would be aliens operating human-shaped bodies they're not fully comfortable in. The strange questions would come from beings who don't understand human culture or conversation norms. The odd appearance details, the missing eyebrows or unnatural skin texture, or incorrect makeup application, would be attempts at disguise that fail because the aliens lack reference points for what humans actually look like. The impossible departures make more sense under this theory. If the men in black are using alien technology, then cars that vanish and materializations without doors and objects that cease to exist become plausible. Not explainable by our physics, but consistent with capabilities more advanced civilization might possess. Even the circular questioning could fit. Aliens trying to understand human psychology, testing responses, gathering data about how humans react to their presence. The warnings to stay silent might be genuine attempts to maintain secrecy, to prevent widespread awareness of extraterrestrial activity before humanity is ready for that knowledge. But this theory has problems too. If aliens wanted to intimidate witnesses, why use such a clumsy approach? Why not simply erase memories, or prevent sightings from happening in the first place, or use their presumably superior technology to ensure silence more efficiently? And why the emphasis on appearance? If you can make coins vanish and cars dematerialize, you can presumably create a perfect human disguise. Why settle for something that looks almost right but not quite? Unless the wrongness is intentional, meant to create confusion, to make witnesses doubt their own perceptions. Or unless the aliens are showing us what they want us to see. Maybe they look nothing like humans. Maybe the men in black form is a construct, a projection, and the flaws in the disguise are unavoidable artifacts of whatever process they're using to manifest in our reality. I read that somewhere. Or I thought it. I'm not sure which anymore. The ideas blend together after a while, especially late at night when I'm trying to organize them into something coherent. There's a psychological theory. Less common, harder to find in the mainstream UFO literature, but it surfaces occasionally in more academic treatments of the phenomenon. This interpretation suggests the men in black are projections, not physical beings but psychological manifestations created by the witness's own mind in response to the stress and cognitive dissonance of having seen something impossible. You see a UFO, something that shouldn't exist, something that violates your understanding of reality. Your mind struggles to process this, to integrate the impossible observation into your worldview. And in that struggle, it creates the men in black. Authority figures who appear to validate the experience by responding to it, but who also create enough confusion and fear that you're discouraged from investigating further or sharing what you saw. The men in black in this model are a defense mechanism, a way for your psyche to process trauma by externalizing it, creating visitors who embody your uncertainty and fear. That's why they're so strange, so wrong. They're not actually trying to pass as human. They're your unconscious mind's representation of the uncanny, the threatening, the authoritative yet alien. The impossible elements, the vanishing cars and disappearing objects are explained as false memories. Confabulations created after the fact to make sense of a dissociative experience. You had a stress response, maybe a brief psychotic break triggered by the UFO sighting. Your mind filled in the gaps with details that feel real but aren't, creating a narrative of visitation that never physically occurred. I find this theory troubling, not because it's implausible, but because it's almost too convenient. It explains everything by explaining nothing. Any detail, no matter how specific or strange, can be dismissed as psychological projection. Any corroboration can be attributed to shared cultural narratives or collective hysteria. And it doesn't account for cases where multiple witnesses saw the men in black, where family members or colleagues were present for the encounter, where physical evidence was confiscated and never returned. Those details suggest something external, something real in the material sense, not just a psychological phenomenon. But maybe I'm too committed to the reality of the encounters. Maybe I want them to be real because a world with men in black is more interesting than a world where they're just stress-induced hallucinations. Maybe my own bias is showing, and I can't be sure. That's the problem with trying to be objective about subjective experiences. The line between analysis and projection gets blurry. I start wondering if my interpretations say more about me than about the phenomenon itself. There are other theories, wilder ones, more difficult to categorize or summarize. Some researchers suggest the men in black are interdimensional beings, entities that exist in parallel realities or adjacent dimensions, occasionally crossing into ours. They appear wrong because they're not adapted to our physical laws, our dimensional structure. They're doing their best to interact with us, but the translation is imperfect, like trying to have a conversation through a badly distorted mirror. Or they're time travelers, humans from the future, coming back to manage the timeline, to prevent certain information from emerging too early. Their strange appearance is because they're operating across temporal boundaries, existing partially in multiple time periods simultaneously. The archaic cars and outdated clothing mix with future technology to create an uncanny blend. Or they're tulpas, thought forms created collectively by belief in them, given substance and agency by the accumulated fear and attention of witnesses and researchers. They started as stories, as rumours, as shared anxieties about government surveillance and alien contact. But over time, through enough people believing in them, fearing them, expecting them, they became real. Not physical exactly, but real enough to manifest, to interact, to leave traces. I don't know where I first encountered these ideas. Some were in books, I'm sure of that. Keel mentioned interdimensional theories. Jacques Vallée wrote about control systems and the manipulation of belief. But others feel like they came from conversations half remembered, or forum posts read late at night, or my own speculation that I've since forgotten was speculation and now treat as something I learned. That bothers me more than it should. The inability to track the source of my own knowledge, to distinguish between what I read and what I imagined and what I've constructed from pieces of both. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the theories are all equally valid or equally invalid when applied to a phenomenon that resists rational analysis. Maybe the men in black are everything and nothing. Government agents and aliens and psychological projections and interdimensional travelers and thought forms all at once, depending on the witness, the context, the moment of encounter. Maybe that's why they're so hard to understand, because they're not one thing. They're a convergence of possibilities, a space where multiple explanations overlap and none quite fits. I lean toward the non-human theories myself, though I couldn't tell you exactly why. Something about the accounts feels too strange for human explanation, even accounting for advanced technology or psychological tactics. The wrongness goes too deep. The pattern is too consistent across decades and geography for it to be purely cultural or psychological. But that's just my intuition, my gut feeling based on immersion in these stories for longer than is probably healthy. It's not evidence, it's not proof. It's just a sense that the men in black are something genuinely other, something that exists outside our normal categories and resists being fitted into them. Or maybe I'm wrong, maybe the most mundane explanation is correct and everything else is embellishment, misperception, the human tendency to make mysteries out of mistakes. I genuinely don't know. The more I learn, the less certain I become. What strikes me about all these theories is how they reflect what we fear or desire. The government theory appeals to those who distrust authority, who see conspiracy and control in everything. The alien theory attracts those who want the universe to be populated, who find comfort or excitement in the possibility of contact with other intelligences. The psychological theory satisfies skeptics, those who want to believe the world makes sense and anomalies can be explained away. The interdimensional and time travel theories appeal to those who enjoy complexity, who prefer mysteries that remain mysterious. We interpret the men in black through the lens of what we already believe. We see in them confirmation of our existing worldviews, and maybe that's what they're designed to do. Maybe their ambiguity is the point. They're a mirror that reflects our own assumptions back at us, showing us what we expect to see. Or maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe they're just what they appear to be. Strange visitors, men in black suits, asking questions, issuing warnings, departing impossibly. Maybe no theory captures them because they're not meant to be captured. They're meant to remain at the edge of understanding, permanent residents of the uncertain space between known and unknown. I wonder sometimes what the men in black themselves would say if asked what they are. If someone had the presence of mind during an encounter to turn the questioning around, to ask the visitor directly, "What are you? Why are you here? What do you want?" Maybe they'd answer honestly. Maybe they'd tell the truth in their flat, mechanical voices, and the witness would understand nothing because the truth exists in concepts we don't have language for. Or maybe they'd lie, or evade, or ask the question back in that circular way they have, turning the conversation around until the witness forgot what they were asking. I suspect we'd learn nothing. The men in black don't seem designed for revelation. They're designed for confusion, for the maintenance of mystery, for ensuring that even when contact occurs, understanding doesn't. The theories will keep evolving. New researchers will propose new interpretations, synthesizing old ideas in novel ways or drawing on emerging concepts from physics or psychology or philosophy. We'll keep trying to explain the men in black, keep searching for the framework that makes them make sense, but I suspect they'll continue to resist, to slip between categories, to defy our best attempts at explanation. Because maybe that's their nature. Maybe they exist in the gaps between theories, in the space our explanations can't quite reach. Maybe understanding them fully would require abandoning the very structures of thought we use to make sense of the world. And most of us aren't prepared to do that. So we keep building theories, keep refining interpretations, keep hoping that the next framework, the next approach, will finally capture what the men in black are, while they continue knocking on doors, asking their strange questions, departing impossibly, remaining as they've always been, just beyond the reach of our understanding. I should probably admit something. I have my own theory. One I haven't mentioned yet. One I'm not sure I believe but can't quite dismiss. I think the men in black might be showing us what we need to see. Not what they are, but what we're ready for. They appear different to different witnesses, emphasize different aspects, create different kinds of wrongness because each encounter is tailored to the person experiencing it. Not in a deliberate way necessarily, but in the way that reality itself might be more fluid, more responsive to observation than we generally acknowledge. The men in black exist in that fluid space. They're defined partly by themselves and partly by the witness, a collaboration between the phenomenon and the observer. That would explain the variations, the contradictions, the way some encounters feel more alien while others feel more governmental. The men in black are reflecting something back at us, showing us our own fears and expectations dressed in dark suits and asking questions we can't quite answer. But I don't know if I believe that. It might just be another theory, another attempt to impose meaning where there might be none. or it might be closer to truth than anything else I've considered. I honestly can't tell anymore. What I do know is that the men in black continue to appear, continue to be reported, continue to leave witnesses confused and frightened and uncertain about what they've experienced. The theories we build around them are useful insofar as they help us think about the phenomenon, consider it from different angles, develop new questions to ask, but they're not the thing itself. They're just maps, and we keep learning that the territory is stranger than any map can capture. So maybe the best approach is uncertainty, holding multiple possibilities simultaneously, accepting that we might never know for sure what the men in black are, where they come from, what they want, living with the mystery instead of trying to solve it. That's harder than it sounds. We want answers, we want resolution, we want the story to make sense in the end. But some stories don't end. They just continue, adding new chapters, new encounters, new details that complicate rather than clarify. The Men in Black story is one of those, still being written, still defying explanation, still knocking on doors somewhere, even now, asking their circular questions and leaving witnesses to figure out what just happened. Chapter 7. Folklore Echoes. Sometimes I wonder if we've encountered them before. Not the Men in Black specifically, not in their current form with the dark suits and the questions about UFOs, but something like them. Something that plays a similar role, occupies a similar space in human experience. The more I read about folklore, about mythology, about the stories people told before we had words like extraterrestrial or interdimensional, the more familiar the pattern becomes. The Men in Black feel new, feel like a modern phenomenon tied to modern anxieties. But maybe they're just the latest iteration of something very old, something that's been knocking on doors, asking strange questions, and leaving people confused for as long as there have been doors to knock on. The Fae come to mind first. The fair folk, the good neighbours, the gentry. All those careful euphemisms people use to avoid saying their real names, avoid drawing their attention. They appeared at thresholds, in doorways at crossroads. They came at dusk or dawn, in the liminal hours when day became night or night became day. They asked for things, offered things, made bargains that seemed simple but had hidden costs, and they looked almost human. Almost. There was always something wrong, something that marked them as other. Eyes too bright, skin too smooth, movements too graceful or too stiff. They wore clothes that seemed fine at first glance but revealed themselves as strange upon closer examination. Made of materials that didn't quite exist, stitched in ways that didn't quite make sense, fashioned according to aesthetics that were almost but not entirely human. People who encountered the Fae would lose time, walk into a fairy ring or follow a light into the woods and emerge hours or days or years later, thinking only moments had passed, or the reverse. Spend what felt like an evening in the Fae realm only to return and find decades had gone by, everyone they knew aged or dead. Time worked differently for them, followed different rules, and when humans crossed into their territory or drew their attention, human time became unreliable. The Men in Black seem to operate in similar temporal spaces. Witnesses report conversations that feel like minutes but consume hours, arrivals that happen too quickly, departures that happen too slowly, moments of missing time, gaps in memory, the sense that duration itself has become elastic and strange. Maybe the Fae never left. Maybe they just adapted, updated their appearance for a new era, traded fairy rings for UFO sightings, ancient hills for modern houses, cryptic bargains for questions about what you saw and who you told. I'm not suggesting literal continuity. I don't think the Men in Black are Fae in any direct sense. But the pattern repeats. The structure remains consistent across cultures and centuries. There's always been something that appears at boundaries. That looks almost human but isn't. That interacts with people in ways that leave them confused and altered. That operates according to rules we don't understand, in service of purposes we can't determine. In Japan they have stories of the Tengu, long-nosed spirits or demons who appear in mountainous areas, who sometimes help humans and sometimes trick them, who wear robes that seem fine but wrong, who speak in riddles and leave cryptic messages. They test people, confuse them, make them question what they thought they knew. In European folklore, there are the black-clad figures who appear before disasters, the dark-robed strangers who knock on doors to deliver warnings or ask strange questions, the Men in Black who were seen before plagues, before battles, before ships sank or buildings burned, harbingers, messengers, figures whose presence indicated that something was about to shift, that a boundary was about to be crossed. The trickster archetype appears in almost every culture. Coyote, Anansi, Loki, Reynard, figures who exist at the edges of things, who blur boundaries and break rules and teach through confusion and chaos. They're neither fully good nor fully evil. They help and hinder, reveal and conceal, tell truth through lies and lies through truths. The men in black have something of the trickster about them, the way they create confusion that might be meaningful or might be random, the way their actions seem purposeful but the purpose remains obscure, the way they teach witnesses something though no one can quite articulate what the lesson is. Maybe that's their function, not to suppress information or protect secrets, though they do that, but to introduce uncertainty, to remind people that reality is stranger than it appears, to crack open the tidy categories we use to organize experience and let a little chaos seep through. Tricksters serve that function in mythology. They keep things from becoming too settled, too certain, too rigid. They're necessary agents of change and disruption, even when the disruption is uncomfortable or frightening. I read something once about threshold guardians, figures who appear at the edges of sacred or forbidden territories, who test those who seek to enter, who turn away the unworthy, who ensure that crossing certain boundaries requires sacrifice or transformation. In myths, these guardians take many forms: dragons at cave mouths, sphinxes asking riddles, ferrymen demanding payment, gatekeepers with questions that must be answered correctly before passage is granted. The men in black might be serving a similar function, marking the boundary between ordinary reality and whatever lies beyond it. Appearing when someone has seen too much, gone too far, approached knowledge they're not supposed to have. Testing them through confusion, through fear, through the imposition of wrongness that forces them to question their own perceptions. If you can withstand the encounter, if you can hold on to what you've seen despite the fear and confusion, then maybe you're allowed to proceed, to continue investigating, continue seeking, continue approaching the truth. But if the encounter breaks you, makes you retreat into silence and doubt, then maybe you weren't ready. Maybe the boundary held. I don't know if I believe that. It might be too neat, too purposeful, imposing mythic structure on something that might just be random and meaningless. But the pattern is there, the resonance between modern men in black encounters and ancient stories about threshold guardians, about fae, about tricksters and harbingers and uncanny messengers. There are stories from medieval Europe about men in black robes who appeared to scholars and alchemists, who came to those who sought forbidden knowledge, who studied things they shouldn't study, who tried to understand mysteries meant to remain mysterious. These dark-robed figures would appear in libraries, in laboratories, in private chambers where scholars worked late into the night. They'd ask questions about the scholars' research, about what they'd discovered, about how close they were to understanding, and then they'd issue warnings, sometimes subtle and sometimes explicit, about the dangers of pursuing certain lines of inquiry. Some scholars listened, destroyed their work, abandoned their research, turned to safer subjects. Others ignored the warnings and continued, and according to the stories, bad things happened to them. Madness, accidents, mysterious deaths. The usual consequences in folklore for those who transgress sacred boundaries. The details change, but the structure remains. Someone seeks knowledge they shouldn't have. A dark figure appears to warn them. The seeker must choose between safety and truth. It's the same choice witnesses to UFOs face when the men in black knock on their doors. The same test. The same pressure to retreat, to forget, to stop asking questions. I've wondered if the men in black are attracted to moments of rupture, times when the ordinary world cracks open and something else shows through. When someone sees a UFO, experiences high strangeness, encounters something that doesn't fit into normal categories, in those moments, reality becomes thin, permeable. The rules that usually keep things separate stop working quite as well, and in that thinness, in that permeability, the men in black can cross through, can manifest, can interact with witnesses in ways they couldn't otherwise. Folklore is full of similar ideas, thin places where the barrier between worlds weakens, times like Samhain or Midsummer when the veil grows thin and spirits can cross, locations like crossroads or wells or certain hills where the boundary is naturally fragile. Maybe UFO sightings create temporary thin places. Maybe the act of witnessing something impossible weakens the barrier for that individual witness, makes them temporarily accessible to things that normally couldn't reach them. And the men in black are drawn to those moments, those openings, those brief windows when communication or contact or whatever it is they do becomes possible. There's something in Celtic folklore called the Dullahan, a headless horseman dressed in black who appears as an omen of death. He rides a black horse, carries his own head under his arm, and appears to those who are about to die or about to witness death. He doesn't cause death directly, he just marks it, announces it. His presence means the boundary is about to be crossed, that someone is about to transition from life to death, from this world to whatever comes after. The men in black feel similar sometimes, not harbingers of physical death, but markers of a different kind of transition. You've seen something that changes you, something that shifts your understanding of what's possible. The men in black appear to mark that transition, to acknowledge it, to ensure you understand that you've crossed a threshold and things won't be quite the same afterward. Maybe that's why they're so unsettling, not because they threaten violence or harm, but because they represent change, transformation, the end of one way of understanding the world and the beginning of another. And most of us resist that. We want things to stay familiar, comprehensible, safe. The men in black remind us that safety is an illusion, that the world is stranger than we pretend, that boundaries we thought were solid are actually quite permeable. I don't mean to romanticize them. The men in black aren't mystical guides or benevolent teachers. The witnesses they visit are genuinely frightened, genuinely confused. The encounters leave damage, create trauma, force people to question their own sanity and reliability. But there's something archetypal about them nonetheless, something that connects to deep patterns in how humans have always understood and feared the unknown. We've always had figures who appear at edges, who mark transitions, who test and confuse and transform. The specific form changes, the cultural context shifts, but the underlying pattern persists. Maybe because the pattern reflects something real, some actual feature of reality that different cultures have interpreted differently, but all recognized as significant. Some genuinely other thing that exists at boundaries and occasionally crosses into our world, manifesting in ways shaped by cultural expectations, but not entirely determined by them. Or maybe it's purely psychological. Maybe humans are wired to create these figures, to populate the edges of their understanding with guardians and tricksters and messengers. Maybe we need boundary markers, need personifications of the unknown, need something to embody our fear and fascination with what lies beyond the familiar. And so we generate them. We see them when we're stressed or frightened or overwhelmed by experiences that don't fit our categories. We dress them in culturally appropriate clothing, make them ask culturally appropriate questions, but the underlying phenomenon is internal. A trick our minds play on us to help process the unprocessable. I go back and forth on this. Some days the folkloric parallels feel like evidence of something real and persistent. Other days they feel like evidence of persistent patterns in human psychology. Both interpretations explain the data. Neither can be proven or disproven. So I remain uncertain, suspended between belief and skepticism, between the idea that the men in black are genuinely other and the idea that they're projections of our own fears. Maybe that uncertainty is appropriate. Maybe it matches the uncertain nature of the phenomenon itself. What I find most interesting is how the men in black have become folklore themselves. They've entered the cultural imagination, become part of the modern mythology we tell about UFOs and government conspiracies and the hidden nature of reality. People who've never encountered them know about them, reference them, use them as shorthand for mysterious authority, for the suppression of truth, for the idea that some knowledge is dangerous, and those who pursue it will be warned away. They've been in movies, television shows, comic books, usually played for laughs, turned into jokes about sunglasses and memory-wiping devices, but sometimes treated seriously, used to evoke genuine unease, to tap into that deep folkloric dread of the uncanny visitor. And in becoming folklore, they've taken on a life of their own. People report encounters shaped by what they've already heard about men in black, see what they expect to see, remember what fits the pattern they've been taught to recognize. That makes it harder to determine what's genuine encounter and what's cultural expectation. But maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe folklore and reality are more intertwined than we usually acknowledge. Maybe the act of believing in something, telling stories about it, expecting it to appear, actually helps bring it into being. Not in a literal magical sense necessarily, but in the sense that belief shapes perception, perception shapes experience, and experience becomes reality for those who have it. I think about the old prohibition against naming the Fae. The idea that speaking about them attracted their attention made encounters more likely. Modern UFO researchers sometimes half-jokingly apply the same rule to the men in black. Don't talk about them too much. Don't focus on them too intensely. They might hear you. They might come. Superstition, probably. Magical thinking. But there are enough accounts of researchers being visited after writing or speaking about the men in black that the pattern seems worth noting. Keel had strange experiences. Barker had strange experiences. Others who documented these encounters reported becoming subjects of them, as if the act of investigating the men in black crosses some threshold, draws attention, marks you as someone who needs to be visited, warned, confused, or maybe it's just confirmation bias. Researchers expect to be visited, so they interpret ambiguous experiences as men in black encounters. They're primed to notice the strangeness, the wrongness, the details that fit the pattern. I don't know which explanation I prefer. Both are unsettling in their own ways. What strikes me most about the folkloric echoes is how persistent the need seems to be. The need for figures who embody the uncanny, who mark boundaries, who remind us that our understanding of the world is incomplete. Every culture generates them. Every era produces new versions. The details change, but the essential nature remains. Dark-clad figures, strange questions, warnings not to proceed, confusion and fear and missing time, the sense that you've encountered something that operates according to rules you don't understand. The men in black are just the latest manifestation, dressed for our era, concerned with our anxieties, appearing in response to our particular way of breaking through the boundaries of acceptable reality. In a few decades, they might take a different form, respond to different triggers, ask different questions, but the underlying pattern will likely persist. Because the pattern seems to be about something fundamental, about the edges of human experience, about what happens when we approach knowledge or contact or transformation we're not quite ready for. The men in black stand at that edge, have always stood there in one form or another, will likely continue standing there long after current witnesses are gone, current theories are forgotten, current accounts are buried in archives, waiting at thresholds, asking their questions, ensuring that those who cross certain boundaries understand what they're doing, or think they do, or think they might, or can no longer tell the difference. I should probably move on. There's more to explore, more aspects of the phenomenon to consider. But the folkloric dimension feels important somehow. Feels like it might be closer to truth than any of the modern technological or governmental explanations. Not because the men in black are literally fae or tricksters or threshold guardians, but because those categories capture something essential about their nature, about what they do and why they might do it. They exist at edges. They mark transitions. They confuse and test and transform. That's their function, whether they're government agents or aliens or psychological projections or something else entirely. And maybe understanding that function matters more than identifying their exact nature. Maybe knowing what they do is more important than knowing what they are, though I'd still like to know both. Still search for answers even as I suspect answers might not exist. Still listen to the old stories and hear echoes of the new ones. Still see the pattern repeating across time and culture and individual experience. Still wonder if the next knock on my door might be them, dark-suited, strangely moved, asking questions I can't answer about things I wish I didn't know, standing at the threshold I wasn't aware I'd already crossed. Chapter 8. Memory and Erasure. There's something I've been noticing as I tell these stories. Something I didn't expect when I started. I'm forgetting details, not the big things, not the core of the accounts, the essential strangeness, but the specifics. Names slip away, dates become uncertain. I remember reading about a case but can't recall where. I think a witness said something, but when I try to verify it, the detail isn't in any account I can find. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I've absorbed too much information and it's starting to blur together. Or maybe there's something about the men in black phenomenon that resists stable memory. That makes forgetting part of the experience, even for those of us who only encounter them through text and testimony. Even for those of us who've never opened our doors to find them standing there. Witnesses talk about this constantly. The difficulty of remembering. The sense that the encounter is slipping away even as they try to hold on to it. They'll describe the visit immediately afterward, while it's fresh, and the account will be detailed and coherent. Then they'll describe it again a week later, and details have changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that suggest deliberate fabrication, but subtly. The visitor's suit was dark blue, not black. Or maybe it was black. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Or was it an hour? The questions were about the UFO sighting, or about something else, or both somehow, though that doesn't quite make sense. The memories shift, become uncertain, develop gaps that weren't there initially, and the witnesses know this is happening. They're aware of the instability of their own recollections. It frustrates them, frightens them, makes them doubt not just what they remember about the men in black, but their memory in general. If they can't reliably recall something as significant as a strange visitor, what else might they be misremembering? What else might be slipping away without them noticing? There's a case I read about, I think it was in Pennsylvania, though I might be wrong about the location. The witness had a UFO sighting, received a visit days later from two men in dark suits, standard pattern. But what made this case notable was that the witness kept detailed notes, wrote everything down immediately after the encounter, time of arrival, description of the visitors, exact questions asked, anything unusual noticed. She did this because she already knew about the men in black, had read accounts, knew that memory became unreliable afterward. So she documented everything while it was fresh, trying to preserve the accuracy of her experience. But when she read her notes days later, they didn't match her memory. The notes described details she'd completely forgotten, conversations she had no recollection of having, and they omitted things she clearly remembered, things that felt central to the encounter, but apparently hadn't seemed important enough to write down at the time. She trusted her notes more than her memory, had to. The notes were created immediately without time for distortion or reinterpretation, but it was disturbing to realize how much her memory had already shifted, how different her remembered version of the encounter was from the documented one. And then, later still, when she looked at the notes again, she found gaps, places where she'd apparently stopped writing mid-sentence, sections that didn't make sense, as if she'd been interrupted or distracted and never returned to finish the thought. She didn't remember stopping, didn't remember any interruption. But the evidence was there on the page. Incomplete sentences, trailing thoughts, blanks where there should have been information. I wonder about those blanks, whether something actively prevented her from finishing, whether the act of documenting was itself disrupted, made difficult, discouraged in ways she didn't consciously register, or whether the memory of what happened in those moments simply never formed properly, whether something about the encounter prevented normal memory consolidation, left gaps that couldn't be filled because they'd never actually contained anything. Brain trauma can do that. Certain drugs can do that. Extreme stress can do that. Disrupt the process by which short-term experience becomes long-term memory, leaving people with holes in their recollection they don't notice until later, when they try to reconstruct events and find pieces missing. Maybe the Men in Black encounters involve something similar. Some disruption of normal cognitive function that prevents memories from forming completely or accurately. Maybe it's technological. Maybe it's biological. Maybe it's a side effect of existing in proximity to something that operates according to different physical laws. Or maybe it's deliberate, a feature, not a bug. The Men in Black don't just intimidate witnesses into silence. They make silence easier by ensuring witnesses can't clearly remember what happened, can't provide coherent accounts, can't hold on to the details that would make their stories believable. I'm experiencing something similar, though on a smaller scale. The more I research this topic, the more I tell these stories, the less certain I become about what I actually know. I remember reading Keel's description of a particular hotel encounter. Or do I? Was it Keel, or another researcher? Was it a hotel, or somewhere else? I have the image in my mind, the details clear and specific, but when I try to trace them back to a source, the connection dissolves. Maybe I'm conflating multiple accounts, blending elements from different cases into a composite that feels like a single coherent memory but isn't. That happens sometimes with research. You absorb so much material that the individual sources blur together, and what you remember is a synthesis rather than any specific text. But it feels like more than that. It feels like the information is actively slipping away, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The harder I grasp, the faster it drains away. I tell myself it's just fatigue. Too many late nights reading case files. Too much immersion in material that's deliberately confusing and contradictory. My brain is tired and making errors, filling in gaps with plausible details that might not be accurate. But a small part of me wonders if it's something else. If focusing this intensely on the men in black, telling their stories, trying to understand their patterns, creates some kind of contact. Not physical contact, not a knock on my door, but something subtler, a resonance, an attention. And with that attention comes the same memory disruption witnesses report, the same difficulty holding on to clarity, the same sense of things slipping away. That's probably paranoid thinking, magical thinking, the kind of thing you convince yourself of when you've spent too long thinking about a topic that encourages paranoia. But witnesses say this too. They talk about how thinking about the men in black talking about them seems to make subsequent memory even more unstable, as if the phenomenon includes a kind of feedback loop. The more you focus on it, the less clearly you can remember it. One witness described it as being like a dream that evaporates upon waking. In the moment of encounter, everything was vivid, real, undeniable. But the moment the visitors left, the experience started to fade. By the next day, it had the quality of a dream. By a week later, they weren't sure it happened at all, except for the lingering fear, the sense that something significant had occurred, even if the details were no longer accessible, and yet some details would remain crystal clear. A single image, the visitor's pale hand holding the doorframe, the way light reflected off their too smooth skin, the exact phrase they used in their flat voice. "It would be better for you not to continue." Those fragments would stay sharp while everything else blurred, as if memory was being selectively edited. Important things preserved, contextual things erased, the overall coherence deliberately destroyed. I've read theories about this, about why the memory disruption might occur. Some researchers think it's protective, the mind's way of defending itself against experiences too strange to integrate. By allowing the memory to fade, by making it dreamlike and uncertain, consciousness protects itself from having to fully accept that the impossible occurred. It's easier to doubt a fading memory than to restructure your entire understanding of reality. Others think it's evidence of direct intervention, that the men in black have the ability to affect memory, to suppress it or alter it, or make it unstable, that this is part of their intimidation strategy. You can't effectively report what you can't clearly remember. You can't convince others of something you yourself are uncertain about. And some think the memory disruption is a side effect of the encounter itself, that whatever the men in black are, however they manifest, the process of interacting with them is inherently disruptive to normal cognition, like trying to remember a conversation you had while half asleep. The memory formation is compromised from the start because consciousness itself is compromised during the encounter. I don't know which explanation I find most convincing. They all seem plausible. They all fit certain aspects of the phenomenon. What bothers me is the thought that there might be true memories, accurate memories, that have been lost. Witnesses who encountered the men in black and had crucial information, clear observations, details that would help us understand what we're dealing with. But those memories eroded, faded, became uncertain and unreliable, and now we're left with fragments, pieces of a larger picture that we can't reconstruct because too much has been lost. It's like trying to complete a puzzle when you know most of the pieces are missing. You can see the general shape, can identify certain clear elements, but the complete image remains inaccessible, and you can never be sure whether the pieces you do have are positioned correctly, or if you're forcing them into a configuration that only seems to make sense. Some witnesses report actively trying to fight the forgetting, rehearsing the encounter in their minds, telling the story repeatedly, recording every detail they can recall before it slips away. But even that doesn't always work. The rehearsal creates its own problems. Each time you recall a memory, you're not accessing the original experience. You're accessing the last time you remembered it, and each access introduces tiny changes, subtle shifts in emphasis or detail. Over time, the memory becomes a memory of memories. Layers of recall stacked on top of each other, each layer slightly different from the one beneath. The original experience, whatever it actually was, gets buried under iterations of itself. And with Men in Black encounters, where the original experience was already strange and confusing, the layering effect makes things even more uncertain. Was the visitor's skin actually pale, or did it just seem pale in that lighting? Did they really move mechanically, or does that description come from having read other accounts and unconsciously importing that detail? The witness can't always tell. Neither can investigators. Neither can I, sitting here trying to reconstruct these stories from second-hand and third-hand accounts, from interviews conducted years after the encounters, from witnesses whose memories have been shaped and reshaped by time and repetition and exposure to other people's stories. There was a researcher, I think his name was. I can't remember now. I had it a moment ago. He specialised in interviewing men in black witnesses, trying to document their accounts as carefully as possible, comparing different tellings to identify stable elements versus drift. He noticed something interesting. The emotional content of the memories stayed consistent even when the factual details changed. Witnesses might disagree with themselves about what colour suit the visitor wore or exactly what questions were asked, but they consistently described the same feelings, the same sense of wrongness, the same fear, the same confusion. That suggests something real at the core, he argued. If the experiences were entirely fabricated or imagined, you'd expect the emotional content to drift as much as the factual details, but it didn't. The fear remained constant. The sense of having encountered something genuinely other, genuinely wrong, persisted even when everything else became uncertain. I find that both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it suggests we're not dealing with pure fantasy, that something genuinely anomalous occurred. Disturbing because it means the fear is the most reliable element. The thing we can be most sure about is that witnesses were deeply frightened by something they can no longer clearly remember. I'm losing my train of thought. What was I saying? Memory and erasure. The way details slip away. This happens to me sometimes now. I'll be mid-sentence and forget where I was going. I'll pause and the thread is gone. I know I was making a point but can't recall what it was. It's probably nothing. Just normal mental fatigue. Too many thoughts crowding together. Too much information without enough rest. But it feels significant. Feels like a symptom of something. Like I'm experiencing in mild form what witnesses describe in extreme form. The erosion of clarity. The sense that something important is just beyond reach. Just on the edge of recall, but won't quite come into focus. There was something I wanted to say about the way memories change. About how even as I tell these stories I'm aware of changing them, of filling in gaps with assumptions, of smoothing over inconsistencies in ways that feel necessary but might be obscuring something true. But what exactly? What was the point? It's gone. That's the thing about the Men in Black phenomenon. The thing that makes it so hard to investigate, so difficult to understand. The evidence keeps dissolving. Witnesses forget. Documents go missing. Photographs get lost or confiscated. And what remains is fragmentary, uncertain, unreliable. We're left building theories on foundations that keep shifting, trying to map territory that changes every time we look at it, attempting to remember what we're in the process of forgetting. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe the memory disruption is the most important aspect of the phenomenon, not a side effect, but the primary mechanism. The Men in Black don't just visit witnesses, they create a particular kind of experience, one that resists documentation, resists clear memory, resists being pinned down and analysed. They exist in the space between certainty and doubt, and they pull witnesses, pull researchers, pull anyone who focuses on them too intensely into that same space, where nothing is quite solid, where memory shifts like sand, where you can't be sure whether you're remembering accurately or constructing plausible narratives to fill the gaps. I should wrap this up, move towards some kind of conclusion, but I'm not sure what conclusion to draw. Memory is unreliable. That's not specific to Men in Black encounters. That's true of human cognition in general. We misremember, we confabulate, we're influenced by suggestion and expectation, and the stories we tell ourselves about our experiences. But with the Men in Black, the unreliability seems amplified, deliberate, as if the encounters are designed to resist being remembered clearly, as if clarity itself is what's being targeted. And maybe that's the point I was trying to make earlier, the point I lost and couldn't quite recover. The Men in Black don't just intimidate people into not talking, they make talking difficult. They ensure that even witnesses who want to share what happened, who resist the intimidation and speak anyway, can't do so coherently, can't provide the clear, consistent accounts that would convince skeptics or satisfy investigators. The memory erosion is a more effective silencing mechanism than threats ever could be, because it makes witnesses doubt themselves, makes them unreliable narrators of their own experiences, makes them wonder if anything actually happened, or if they imagined it, or if they're misremembering something mundane as something strange. And here I am, telling these stories feeling the same uncertainty, the same erosion of confidence, the same sense that I'm forgetting something important while remembering things that might not be accurate. Is that because I've spent too long immersed in accounts designed to confuse, or because the phenomenon itself reaches beyond individual encounters, creates a field of uncertainty that affects anyone who focuses on it too intensely? I don't know. Can't know. That's the frustrating thing. All I can do is tell the stories as best I remember them, acknowledge the gaps, accept the uncertainty, and hope that even in their fragmentary, unreliable form, these accounts preserve something true, something that matters even if I can't quite remember why. There was a witness who described the men in black visit as feeling like waking up, like they'd been in some kind of altered state during the encounter and only realized it afterward. During the visit, everything seemed normal, or at least acceptable. The strangeness didn't fully register. It was only later, trying to remember, that the wrongness became apparent. Like looking at a photograph and noticing details you missed when you were actually present at the event. The memory reveals things the experience obscured. Or maybe the memory invents things the experience never contained. Maybe the strangeness is retroactive, applied afterward. A way of making sense of something that was actually mundane but felt significant. I can't distinguish anymore. Can't tell if the witnesses are recovering hidden details or constructing meaningful narratives from ambiguous experiences. Both feel possible, both fit the pattern, and so I remain suspended, between belief and doubt, between trusting the accounts and questioning them, between remembering and forgetting, which is maybe where the men in black want us, have always wanted us, uncertain, confused, unable to speak with conviction about what we think we know, silence through erosion, control through the destruction of clear memory. If that's their goal, it's working, has been working for decades, and will continue working for as long as witnesses keep encountering them, keep trying to remember, keep finding that the details slip away like water through fingers, leaving only the fear, the certainty of wrongness, the knowledge that something happened, even if we can't quite recall what. Chapter 9. Cultural Impact. The men in black escaped. That's the best way I can think to describe it. They started as whispered accounts, stories shared between UFO researchers, letters exchanged by mail, conversations at conferences and meetings, a pattern noticed by a few people who compared notes and realized they were hearing similar things from different witnesses in different places. It was underground knowledge, esoteric, known to those who moved in certain circles but invisible to everyone else. And then it spread, leaked into the wider culture, became something more than isolated encounters, became a phenomenon people recognized, referenced, incorporated into their understanding of how the world worked. The men in black became famous, or infamous. They became part of the mythology we tell about UFOs and government conspiracies and hidden truths, and in becoming famous, they changed. Or maybe we changed them. Maybe the same thing. I'm not sure when exactly it happened. The transition from underground lore to mainstream awareness. It was gradual, I think. Through the 60s and 70s, more books mentioned them. More researchers wrote about them. More witnesses came forward with accounts. Gray Barker's book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, brought them to wider attention. Published in 1956, I believe, though I might be off by a year or two. It compiled accounts, documented the pattern, made the men in black a recognized part of UFO research, rather than just scattered rumors. John Keel's work amplified them further. His books were more widely read, reached audiences beyond the UFO community. People who'd never heard of Albert Bender or Robert Richardson learned about the men in black through Keel's thorough, unsettling documentation. And gradually the stories spread. Into magazines, into documentaries, into conversations between people who'd never seen a UFO but were fascinated by the idea that witnesses to strange phenomena received strange visits. The pattern became recognizable. Men in black suits, odd behavior, warnings to stay silent. Even people who'd never encountered them knew the outline, could reference them in shorthand, could use Men in Black as a phrase that conveyed a whole complex of ideas about secrecy and intimidation and the boundaries of acceptable knowledge. But something happened in that spreading. Something shifted. The early accounts had a particular texture, a quality of genuine strangeness. Witnesses described encounters that confused them, frightened them, left them uncertain about what they'd experienced. The details were specific and weird. Hairless visitors with bright red lipstick, mechanical movements, vanishing coins, questions that circled without going anywhere. It felt authentic. Felt like people describing something real that they didn't fully understand. But as the Men in Black became more widely known, as more people heard the stories and expected to see the pattern, something changed in how they were reported and discussed. The accounts became more uniform, more consistent. Witnesses would describe encounters that hit all the expected notes. Black suits, check. Pale skin, check. Strange questions, check. Impossible departure, check. It was too neat. Too much like people were reporting what they'd been taught to expect rather than what had actually surprised and confused them. I don't mean to suggest the later accounts are all fabricated. I don't think that's true. But I do think cultural awareness changes how people experience and remember things. Once you know the Men in Black pattern, once you've internalized it, you're more likely to interpret ambiguous experiences through that lens. A strange visitor becomes a man in black. Odd questions become warnings. Missing time becomes evidence of the phenomenon rather than just a gap in memory. The cultural template shapes the experience, or shapes the memory of the experience, or both. And the original strangeness, the genuinely uncanny quality of those early encounters, gets diluted, becomes generic, becomes a set of checkboxes rather than a lived experience of wrongness that defies categorization. I mourn that a little. The loss of specificity, the way cultural knowledge can sand down the sharp edges of genuine mystery. Though maybe I'm romanticizing the early accounts. Maybe they were always shaped by expectation, just different expectations. Maybe there's no pure encounter, no unmediated experience. Maybe culture always shapes how we perceive and remember, and the Men in Black have always been partially constructed by the frameworks we use to understand them. And then came the entertainment industry. The Men in Black became characters, appeared in movies, television shows, comic books, usually as government agents with advanced technology, sometimes with a comic edge, rarely with the genuine unsettling quality of the original accounts. The 1997 movie Men in Black is what most people think of now when they hear the phrase. Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones in sharp suits, fighting aliens, erasing memories with a flash of light. It's fun, it's clever, it's well made, but it's also sanitized, domesticated. The Men in Black in that movie are heroes, protectors. They're on our side, keeping us safe from knowledge we can't handle, fighting threats we don't know exist. That's almost the opposite of the original phenomenon. The original Men in Black weren't protecting anyone. They were threatening, confusing, wrong in ways that suggested they might be the threat, not the defenders against it. But the movie was more palatable, easier to consume, and it was successful, spawned sequels and merchandising and a whole franchise built on the idea of secretive agents managing alien contact. And in the process, it overwhelmed the original accounts, made them harder to take seriously, turned Men in Black into a reference to a movie rather than a genuine mystery. I wonder what witnesses from the 50s and 60s would think about that. The ones who opened their doors to find pale, hairless visitors, who made coins vanish and spoke in mechanical voices, who were genuinely frightened, who withdrew from UFO research because the encounter shook them so deeply. Would they recognize their experiences in the Hollywood version? Or would they feel like something essential had been lost, stolen, transformed into entertainment that completely missed the point? I suspect the latter. The movie Men in Black are funny, competent, human, ultimately, even when they're dealing with aliens. They have personalities, motivations, character arcs. And the real Men in Black, if the accounts are accurate, had none of that. They were uncanny, inhuman or barely human, operating according to logic we couldn't follow. They weren't characters. They were phenomena, events, ruptures in normal reality. You can't make a summer blockbuster about that. Not easily. So the Hollywood version softened them, made them comprehensible, made them heroes, and in doing so made the original phenomenon harder to discuss seriously. This happens with a lot of paranormal and anomalous phenomena. They start as genuine mysteries, genuinely unsettling encounters reported by credible people, and then culture gets hold of them, turns them into entertainment, simplifies them, makes them friendly and consumable and ultimately forgettable. Bigfoot becomes a joke, ghosts become Halloween decorations, UFOs become science fiction tropes. The original mystery, the thing that actually confused and frightened people, gets buried under layers of cultural reinterpretation, and eventually it becomes almost impossible to have a serious conversation about the real phenomenon, because everyone's thinking about the movie version, the commercial version, the sanitized version designed for mass consumption. The Men in Black suffered this fate perhaps more thoroughly than most anomalies. They became a brand, a concept, a shorthand in conspiracy theories and science fiction, and the witnesses who actually encountered them, who actually experienced the fear and confusion and wrongness, found their experiences appropriated, turned into entertainment, made unserious. But maybe that's another form of erasure, another way the phenomenon protects itself. If the Men in Black encounters were meant to create confusion, to make witnesses doubt themselves, to ensure that even when people spoke about what happened they weren't taken seriously, then cultural appropriation serves that purpose perfectly. Try to tell someone today that you were visited by Men in Black. What's their first response? Probably a reference to the movie, a joke about getting your memory erased, an assumption that you're not being serious, that you're making a cultural reference rather than describing a real experience. The Hollywood version has made it almost impossible to discuss the real phenomenon without immediately invoking the fictional one, and that discredits the real accounts more effectively than any intimidation tactic could. The witnesses become their own joke. Their experiences become punchlines, and the truth, if there is truth buried in those accounts, becomes inaccessible beneath layers of entertainment and cultural noise. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe the Men in Black, or whoever or whatever is behind the phenomenon, allowed or even encouraged the cultural appropriation because it serves their purposes. Make silence easier to maintain when speech is automatically dismissed. Or maybe I'm giving too much credit. Maybe it's just what culture does. Takes mysterious things and makes them familiar. Takes frightening things and makes them entertaining. No grand conspiracy. Just the normal process of mythology evolving and adapting. I've noticed something in the more recent accounts. The ones from the 2000s and 2010s. The witnesses often reference the movie. They'll describe an encounter and then add, "But it wasn't like the movie. It was much stranger. Much more frightening." They have to explicitly distance their experience from the cultural version everyone knows. Have to clarify that what happened to them wasn't fun, or exciting, or heroic, was actually disturbing in ways the movie never captured. That seems significant. The cultural version has become the baseline, the reference point, and genuine experiences have to be defined in opposition to it. It's backward. The fiction is so dominant that reality has to justify itself as different from the fiction. The map has replaced the territory in people's minds, and the actual territory has to announce itself as not being the map. That must be frustrating for witnesses. To have your genuine fear, your genuine confusion, immediately associated with a Will Smith comedy. To have to constantly clarify that, no, it wasn't like that. It was nothing like that. Why does everyone keep mentioning the movie? But the cultural spread wasn't all negative. In some ways, wider awareness helped. Witnesses who might have thought they were alone, who might have questioned their sanity, could discover that others had similar experiences, could find communities, forums, researchers who took them seriously, could contextualize their encounter within a larger pattern. That's valuable. The isolation of anomalous experience is part of what makes it so disturbing. Thinking you're the only one, that what happened to you is unique and inexplicable, that no one else could possibly understand. Learning that others have been there, have encountered the same strangeness, have struggled with the same confusion and fear, that helps, provides validation even when it doesn't provide explanation. So the cultural spread of Men in Black lore created networks, connected people across distance and time, allowed pattern recognition on a scale that wouldn't have been possible when each encounter was isolated and unknown to everyone except the witness and maybe a few local researchers. And the spread also generated more documentation, more people writing about encounters, recording interviews, preserving accounts, more material for future researchers to analyze, to compare, to mine for patterns. Even if some of that material is influenced by cultural expectations, Even if witnesses are unconsciously shaping their accounts to fit the template they've learned, there's still value in having a large corpus of reports. Patterns emerge even from contaminated data. Anomalies stand out against the background of culturally influenced accounts. A researcher who knows what to look for can identify the genuine weird details amid the generic ones, can spot the accounts that feel authentic versus the ones that feel like they're just hitting expected marks. It's harder work, requires more skepticism, more careful analysis, but it's not impossible. So the cultural spread is complicated, diluted some things, enabled others, made serious investigation harder in some ways, easier in others. Like most cultural phenomena, it's messy, contains contradictions, can't be evaluated as simply good or bad. I think what bothers me most is the loss of fear. The original accounts are frightening, genuinely unsettling. Reading about Hopkins and his vanishing coin, or Richardson and his disappearing car, or the countless hotel encounters with their mechanical visitors and missing time, creates a sense of unease that's hard to shake. These aren't fun mysteries, they're disturbing mysteries. They suggest that reality is more permeable than we want to believe. That things can cross into our world that don't belong here, that don't follow our rules, that might not have our best interests in mind. That's frightening in a deep way, an existential way. It threatens our sense of safety, our assumption that we understand the basic structure of the world we inhabit. But the cultural versions aren't frightening. They're exciting, adventurous. The men in black become characters in a thrilling story, obstacles to overcome, puzzles to solve. The fear gets replaced by entertainment, and something essential is lost in that replacement. The fear was the signal, the indicator that something genuinely anomalous was occurring. When it gets stripped away, when the men in black become just another pop culture reference, we lose touch with what made them significant in the first place. I wonder if anyone still encounters them, the real ones, the genuinely wrong ones, or if the cultural saturation has changed the phenomenon itself. If the men in black appeared because they could exist in the gaps of cultural understanding, and now those gaps are filled with Will Smith movies and conspiracy theories, maybe there's no space left for the real thing to manifest. Maybe the original phenomenon has retreated, found new forms, adapted to the changed cultural landscape by becoming something else entirely. Or maybe encounters still happen exactly as they did in the 50s and 60s, but we don't hear about them anymore. Because witnesses know their accounts will be dismissed, will be compared to movies, will be turned into jokes. So they stay silent, keep their encounters private, don't add to the documented pattern. That would be ironic. The cultural awareness that was supposed to help witnesses connect and share their experiences instead silences them, makes them more isolated than they would have been before everyone knew about the men in black. Silence through overexposure, secrecy maintained by making the truth indistinguishable from fiction. There's a part of me that wants to believe the Hollywood version killed the real phenomenon, that by making the men in black into entertainment, into knowable and manageable characters, we somehow banish the actual mystery. Like naming something gives you power over it. By naming the men in black, by incorporating them into our cultural mythology, by making them familiar and unthreatening, maybe we ended whatever was actually happening. But that's probably wishful thinking, magical thinking. The idea that fiction can overwrite reality, that cultural interpretation can eliminate genuine phenomena. More likely, the men in black are still out there, still knocking on doors, still confusing witnesses, still operating according to rules we don't understand. We've just made it harder to talk about them, harder to take them seriously, harder to investigate without constantly battling against cultural associations that dilute and distort the actual mystery. I keep coming back to those early accounts. Bender shutting down his organization in fear, Hopkins watching a coin vanish, Richardson's car disappearing on an empty road. Those stories still have power, still create that deep unease, still suggest that something genuinely strange was happening. All the cultural noise, all the movies and jokes and conspiracy theories can't quite erase that. The strangeness persists, lurks beneath the entertainment, waits for anyone willing to look past the Hollywood version and engage with the actual accounts. And when you do that, when you read the original stories with attention and openness, the fear comes back, the sense that we're dealing with something real, something that doesn't care about our cultural interpretations or our attempts to make it safe and consumable. The men in black existed before we knew how to talk about them. They might continue existing regardless of how we talk about them now, and one night, someone will open their door, find a pale figure in a black suit standing there, ask questions that don't quite make sense, watch them leave in ways that violate physics, and that person will try to talk about it, will discover that no one takes them seriously, will find their experience drowned out by cultural references and jokes and assumptions, will learn that sometimes the best way to silence someone is to let them speak, and then make sure no one listens. The Men in Black won. If there was a competition between maintaining mystery and becoming explained, they won. They're everywhere in culture now. Everyone knows about them. And because everyone knows about them, no one knows about them. The real phenomenon is hidden behind its own fame, obscured by its cultural success. And somewhere they're still knocking, still asking questions, still making witnesses doubt their own memories and perceptions, still operating in that space between what we can prove and what we can only suspect. Still there, always there, no matter how many movies get made or jokes get told, waiting at thresholds, marking boundaries, ensuring that some mysteries remain mysterious despite our best attempts to solve them, or because of our best attempts to solve them, I'm not sure which anymore. Chapter 10. Closing reflections and wind down. We've been at this for a while now, moving through accounts and theories and folklore echoes, trying to make sense of something that might resist sense by its very nature. I'm tired. You're probably tired too. That's good. That's what we're here for, to drift through these stories until sleep comes naturally, until the boundary between waking thought and dream becomes permeable enough to cross without noticing. The Men in Black exist at boundaries. We've established that, I think, at thresholds, at the edges of what we know and what we don't. At the moment when someone has seen too much or asked too many questions or gotten too close to something they weren't meant to find. Maybe that's all they are, markers, indicators, signs that you've wandered into territory that's more complicated than you realized. Not necessarily hostile, not necessarily trying to harm, just there, maintaining the boundary, ensuring that crossing it comes with consequences, with confusion, with fear, with the knowledge that you can't uncross it, can't return to not knowing what you now know. I've been thinking about why they frighten us so deeply, why the accounts are so unsettling, even when nothing explicitly violent occurs. I think it's because they represent a particular kind of fear, not the fear of physical danger, not the fear of death or pain or loss, but the fear of wrongness, the fear that the world is not what we thought it was, that the rules we rely on don't actually hold, that reality is more permeable, more uncertain, more strange than we've been pretending. That's a deep fear, maybe the deepest, because it undermines everything. If the Men in Black can exist, if they can knock on doors and make coins vanish and depart impossibly, then what else might be true? What other assumptions might be wrong? It's the fear of ontological instability, the ground shifting beneath your feet, the realization that you've been walking on ice you thought was solid ground, and now you can see the water moving beneath it. The Men in Black crack that ice, create fissures, make witnesses aware of depths they'd been happily ignoring, and once you're aware, you can't become unaware, can't unsee what you've seen, can't return to the comfortable assumption that everything makes sense and nothing genuinely impossible ever happens. But here's something I've been considering, something that might be comforting or might not be depending on how you look at it. Maybe the Men in Black only appear when we're ready for them, not ready in the sense of prepared or willing, but ready in the sense of having already crossed a threshold that makes their appearance possible. You see a UFO, you witness something impossible. In that moment, you've already left the territory of normal reality. You've already crossed the boundary. The Men in Black don't create the crossing. They acknowledge it. They're the response to a transition that's already occurred. If that's true, then they're less like guards preventing entry, and more like guides marking a path you've already begun walking. They appear to confuse you, yes, to frighten you, but also to confirm that yes, you did see what you thought you saw. Yes, the impossible does happen. Yes, reality is stranger than you believed. The confusion and fear are the price of that confirmation, the cost of knowing rather than wondering. Maybe that makes them less threatening, or maybe more threatening, I can't decide. I wonder if I'll ever encounter them, if focusing on them this intensely, telling their stories, thinking about them night after night, creates enough resonance that I cross some invisible threshold and they notice. Part of me wants that, wants the confirmation, wants to experience firsthand what I've only read about, only imagined. wants to open the door and find someone standing there who shouldn't exist, just to know for certain that the world is as strange as these accounts suggest. But a larger part of me hopes it never happens, because I know I'm not ready for that encounter, know that it would shake me in ways I can't predict or prepare for. Know that the confusion and fear would be worse than I'm imagining, that reading about these things is very different from experiencing them. So I remain uncertain, wanting confirmation but hoping to avoid it, drawn to the mystery but grateful for the distance that separates me from it. That's probably a common feeling, the same tension many witnesses felt before their encounters. Curious about UFOs, interested in mysteries, but not actually wanting to become part of the pattern, wanting to observe from safety, not to be observed. And then the boundary collapsed anyway. The knock came anyway, and safety turned out to be an illusion. But you're safe tonight, probably, almost certainly. The men in black are rare. For every person who reports an encounter, there are millions who never experience anything unusual, who live their entire lives without opening the door to find someone pale and mechanical standing there asking impossible questions. The odds are heavily in your favour. You can think about these stories, find them interesting or frightening or both, without ever having to experience them directly. You can drift off to sleep knowing that the world is probably exactly as stable and comprehensible as you've always believed it to be. That the accounts we've been exploring are just stories, just words, just things that happen to other people in other times and places, and if somewhere in the back of your mind there's a small voice suggesting that maybe, possibly, the world is stranger than that, maybe the men in black are real, maybe boundaries are more permeable than we pretend, well, you can let that voice fade as you fade. Let it dissolve into the general uncertainty of the half-asleep mind where all things seem possible, and nothing seems entirely real. Dreams are like that, like men in black encounters. Strange visitors appear, conversations happen that don't quite make sense, time becomes fluid, details slip away upon waking. Maybe that's all these accounts are, waking dreams, moments when consciousness becomes just unstable enough that the impossible seems to manifest, seems to knock on doors, seems to ask questions, and then you wake fully. And the encounter fades, and you're left uncertain whether it happened or whether you imagined it, whether the visitor was real, or whether your mind created them from stress and expectation, and the deep human need to populate the unknown with presences we can almost understand. I don't know. Can't know. That's the theme we keep returning to. Uncertainty. The inability to be sure. The gap between what happened and what we can prove happened. Maybe that's where we're meant to be, in that gap. Neither fully believing nor fully dismissing. Holding the possibility of strangeness without insisting on it. Remaining open to mystery without demanding it reveal itself. The men in black will continue doing whatever they do, knocking on doors, asking questions, confusing witnesses, operating according to rules we don't understand. They've been doing it for decades, probably longer in different forms, probably will continue for decades more, adapting to new contexts, responding to new triggers, maintaining whatever boundary they exist to maintain. We'll keep collecting accounts, keep building theories, keep trying to understand, keep falling short of complete understanding, but getting closer to something, even if we can't quite name what that something is. And individual witnesses will keep having encounters, keep opening doors to find pale figures in dark suits, keep experiencing wrongness that they'll struggle to describe and others will struggle to believe. Keep crossing thresholds they didn't know existed until they'd already crossed them. That's the pattern. It continues. It persists. It remains mysterious despite our best efforts to solve it. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. Some boundaries are meant to remain marked but not fully understood. Some phenomena exist to remind us that we don't have everything figured out, that reality is larger and stranger than our categories can capture. Let them knock. Let them ask their questions. Let them maintain their boundaries. We'll keep living our lives. Keep encountering the strange when we encounter it. Keep trying to make sense of the senseless when it crosses our paths. And mostly we'll be fine. We'll open doors to expected visitors. We'll have normal conversations. We'll experience time in its regular, linear way. We'll wake up remembering our nights clearly and accurately. The vast majority of our experiences will be comprehensible. We'll fit the patterns we understand. We'll confirm rather than challenge our basic assumptions about how the world works. And when something strange does happen, When we hear an account that unsettles us or experience something ourselves that doesn't quite fit, we'll process it as best we can. We'll tell the story, or keep it private. We'll seek explanations or live with uncertainty. We'll incorporate it into our understanding or hold it separately as an anomaly. We'll continue. That's what we do. We continue despite mysteries, despite encounters, despite the occasional realization that we understand less than we thought. It's late now, or early. Time has gotten loose while we've been talking. That happens sometimes. You start telling stories and hours pass without notice. The boundary between night and day becomes uncertain. But it's winding down now. The stories have been told. The pattern has been explored. The theories have been considered. The uncertainty has been acknowledged. What remains is rest, sleep, the gentle dissolution of waking consciousness into something more fluid and forgiving. Your eyes are tired. Your thoughts are slowing. The boundary between awareness and sleep is thinning, becoming permeable, easy to cross without effort or intention. You can let yourself drift. Let the stories fade. Let the men in black recede into whatever space they occupy when we're not thinking about them, not telling their accounts, not wondering what they are or why they knock on doors. They're there, somewhere, but not here, not now, not tonight. And if there is a knock, if you hear something at your door in the deepest part of the night, if you wake to find yourself walking toward an entrance where someone might be standing, pale and mechanical and wrong, well, it can wait until morning. Whatever it is, whatever they want, whatever questions they've come to ask, it can wait. You're safe in this moment, in this breath, in this slow descent into sleep. The boundaries are holding, the door is closed, the night is quiet. And if the men in black are out there somewhere, knocking on other doors, asking other questions, confusing other witnesses, that's happening in a different space, a different time, a different story than the one you're part of right now. Right now you're just drifting, just letting go, just allowing sleep to come in its own time, at its own pace. The stories are over, the accounts have been told, the pattern has been recognized. What we're left with is the same thing we started with: mystery, uncertainty, the knowledge that the world is stranger than we generally acknowledge, but also more stable than our fears suggest. Most nights nothing knocks, most doors open to expected visitors, most encounters make sense, and when they don't, when something wrong crosses our threshold, we do what humans have always done. We survive it, we process it. We tell the story if we can, or hold it quietly if we must. We continue. The men in black don't stop us, they confuse us, frighten us, make us uncertain, but they don't stop us. We're still here, still thinking, still wondering, still drifting towards sleep with stories in our minds and questions in our hearts, still crossing boundaries we don't fully understand, still encountering strangeness, still trying to make sense of the senseless, still human, still continuing, still here. Rest now. Let it all fade. Let the men in black recede into the uncertain space between memory and dream. Let the questions dissolve into the general mystery of existence. Let the fear transform into something gentler, curiosity maybe, or acceptance, or simple exhaustion that makes even strange things feel distant and manageable. Sleep is waiting, has been waiting, is patient and kind and requires nothing from you except permission. So give it permission. Let yourself go. Let consciousness loosen and drift and finally release its hold. The night is quiet, the door is closed, the stories are told, and if something knocks, if someone comes, if the impossible manifests while you're sleeping, well, it can wait until morning. Everything can wait until morning. You can rest now, knowing that you're safe and that there's nowhere else you need to go tonight. Let the last of the day drift away as you settle in, unhurried, already almost there. Good night.